Ancient Evil. Trask, Bounty Hunter Volume 1. By James Viner. Interlude 1. 1 week ago. The whir of the focused beam laser cutter abruptly shut off, and there was a loud grinding as the section of stone that had been sliced away was pulled slowly upwards by mechanized hands. Light infused blue by a Codra's surface entered the chamber, trickling at first then stabbing down in a wide beam as the section of the ceiling was removed. There was a slight gasp as the pocket of air filling the tomb was released. The light inside the chamber increased as a drone floated downwards through the hole, the incandescent glow of its lamp filling the chamber. It hummed gently as it hovered just below the square hole in the ceiling, turning through a full circle. After a moment the drone moved clear of the hole, then swam across to the center of the chamber and remained motionless, its light powerful, but only powerful enough to fill the space with twilight. Professor Christoph Klaus floated down into the chamber through the hole in the ceiling, his weight supported by the anti-grav suspensor around his waist. Tui, Jacobs and Milner floated down behind him, one after the other. The four men looked around the chamber, their eyes wide with excitement. "It's 13th century, maybe even 12th, Jacobs said, smiling widely. "Look at these inscriptions. We've never seen script like this." He stepped forward towards the stone slab that stood vertically on the floor, peering closer at the hieroglyphics that covered it. "Don't touch anything," Klaus hissed. Jacobs flinched as if slapped. "Of course not," he said. There were 6 of these vertical stone slabs, forming a perfect circle around the center of the chamber. In their center lay a dais of some kind, its beveled rim covered with more of the hieroglyphics. Klaus stepped closer to the dais and squatted down in front of it. He began to read the hieroglyphics, the corners of his mouth turning up slightly as he read. Tui and Milner stood by one of the other slabs, making their own appraisal of the script. "Some of it's like the inscriptions of inside the main citadel," Milner said, "but a lot of this is new. We've never seen some of these characters before." Tui nodded. "I can make out some of it though. Ugar sus trul shagish," he read aloud, human tongue struggling to pronounce the words of an alien language that had not been used for over 1,000 years. Ugar truglesh sus. Tui paused, a frown appearing on his face as the meaning became clearer. "Within lies power over life," he translated quietly. "Within lies the secret of the beyond." Tui looked up at Milner. The two men exchanged worried glances. "This chamber wasn't built to bury one of their priests," Milner said, realizing the significance of the words. "It was built to imprison one of them." "No, not a priest," said Klaus from the dais, his voice carrying easily through the confined space. "Something much more powerful than a mere priest." He stood up and turned to face the others too. The light from the drone was partially blocked by one of the stone slabs, the shadow hiding his eyes. "I've spent more than 20 years looking for this," he whispered. "Some of these characters are new," Tui said again. "We don't know their meaning. If we understood what they meant, we might understand what the ancient Shtu were trying to hide here." "Ganushtro hekastakik pala," Klaus read easily, his pronunciation measured and assured. "Kalan truglesh mutar sesh u shtiger tichusdach rylash khu." He stepped forward towards the stone slab, and the light fell across half his face, catching on his eyes which seemed to glow somehow. "Not for the weak are the words from beyond," he translated. "Those who would know eternity must hold the will to seek." "We should get out of here," Jacobs said. "This is dangerous." Klaus ignored him. As he approached the slab, Tui and Milner took a step back away from him. Klaus reached out and touched the hieroglyphics with the tips of his fingers. He traced over the embedded characters as he read them aloud. "Koenig selosh mush dehoy u titugish gruela. Koenig sesh kalan sesh parla shagish." As Klaus's fingers moved across the surface, there was a burning smell. Milner looked around, before realizing the smell was coming from Klaus's fingertips. And with that realization, he found that he could feel heat from the slab now too. "What does it mean, Professor?" Tui whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "It means power," Klaus said, his fingers continuing to trace over the inscriptions. These was a gentle hum from behind them, and the sound of stone scraping against stone, as the dais began to move. Chapter 1. Supervisor Keltry waved his hand in front of the holoswitch for accepted, and the screen on his datapad indicated that it had saved the data, then brought up a new entry form. The energy beams of the security gate flickered off. "You're cleared for entry," Keltry told the trader. "Welcome to a Codraw." The trader muttered his thanks and walked through the gate. Its sensors registered his passage through the gate, then the row of blue energy beams flickered on again, active once more. "Next," Keltry said. The man stepped forward and placed his data ident on the counter, without a word. Keltry looked at him for a moment, and the man stared back blankly. He was tall, over 6 feet, and well-muscled, like a boxer. He was probably around 40. His hair was cropped short, and his jaw carried a day or two of stubble. There was something about his eyes, though, that made Keltry uncomfortable. They were blank and expressionless, completely cold. Keltry had seen that look before. He had seen it in Killers. As he slid the man's data ident over the scanner, Keltry's screen filled with the details. "Silas Trask," Keltry said, reading the man's name from the screen. "Gress. You're a long way from the center." The man said nothing, clearly uninterested in idle conversation. "What brings you to a Codraw?" Keltry asked. "Business," the man said, his voice low and hard. "What sort of business?" Keltry said, fixing his stare on the man. "Executing a warrant." Keltry gave a small nod. "A TLC agent," he said with distaste. TLC was a pejorative meaning track, locate, capture, and Keltry had deliberately used it as an insult. The man gave no reaction. "You have the warrant?" Keltry asked. Trask took a small data card from the folds of his cloak and placed it on the counter. He held his finger on it long enough for the device to read his biometrics. The seal of the authority glowed faintly, a blue line running across its surface to show it was genuine, then flickered off. Keltry reached across the counter for the data card, but Trask held it in place. Keltry looked at him, a frown of annoyance forming on his face. "Can I see the details?" Keltry asked. "No." Keltry looked harder at the man, the frown growing. He was not entitled to see the warrant's details, but had expected capitulation from the man nonetheless. "Why not?" Keltry asked, making his annoyance clear. "Client requested discretion." Keltry stared him down for a moment longer. He briefly considered insisting on reading the warrant, but if the man continued to refuse, Keltry would be forced to back down and would look foolish. He let it go. "The Ando's with you." Keltry nodded to the unnaturally thin figure in the cloak behind the man. The android's face was made of cheap, rubberized plating, rather than the more expensive synthetic flesh of newer models. His cloak covered most of his body, but it was clear that his frame was tall and unnaturally thin. The man nodded. "Are either of you armed?" The man and the android both lifted their left hands to the front of their cloaks and slowly drew them to the side, displaying the holsters each wore across their chests, and the low-powered stun pistols held in them. "Stun only," the man said. Keltry nodded. "All right. No licensing or wait times required." The man said nothing, clearly aware of the rules. "How long will you be on a Codraw?" Keltry asked. 4 days. Maybe less." Keltry looked at his screen again. There was something about this Silas Trask that made him uncomfortable, but he could see no basis for refusing him entry. He read over the screen again, making a show of considering carefully whether to allow the man entry. The man simply stood there, looking blankly at Keltry, and giving no response at all. Eventually Keltry ran his hand over the accepted icon. "You're cleared for entry," he said. "Welcome to a Codraw." Without a word, the man stepped forward through the gate, the android a couple of paces behind him. As they passed, Keltry gave a slight shudder, but was unable to say why. On the other side of the gate were a row of 6 authority troopers, all wearing the heavy body armor and helmets of colonial troopers, and all armed with large-caliber firearms. Hardly surprising the officer at the gate was so cocky, Trask thought, as he and Peavy passed through, and the blue energy beams flickered on behind them again. "Wait," the trooper closest to the door said as they approached. His voice crackled through the speaker in his helmet, slightly distorted. Weapons check. The security gate had just scanned them, so this was nothing more than a show of authority or an attempt to intimidate them. Trask and Peavy both opened their cloaks, holding them wide open so the trooper in front could inspect them. He gave them both a brief once-over, then nodded. UTLC, the trooper asked. Trask nodded. Capture warrant only. Not a termination. Okay. See that you don't forget that. Name? Trask said. What about the Ando? The trooper asked. Trask hid his surprise. It was rare for the authority to even acknowledge an android, let alone give it the respect of a name. I am PV-1286, Peavy said, his words carefully enunciated and carrying the sing-song quality of his outdated voice unit. The trooper nodded. Thought I recognized a peacekeeper. You serve at Hell's Circle. Yes, Peavy said, my unit was stationed at URAC 5. 5, the trooper said, clearly surprised, never got that close. My unit was on 7. We would have been lost if it wasn't for the peacekeepers. Unexpectedly, he held out his forearm to Trask. Name's Tanza. Good to know you. Likewise, Trask said, gripping the man's forearm in a monkey grip, we're not here to cause you any trouble. Appreciate that, Tanza said. A lot of TLC don't think the rules count this far from the center. Makes things harder than they need to be, you know? Trask nodded. We're looking for a place called Kura's Well. Anything we need to know? Kura's Well, Tanza said, the pronunciation guttural and phlegmy, near impossible to say any of these alien names properly, but it's their planet, right? Got to at least try. Trask said nothing but felt surprise. An authority trooper who respected androids and aliens. No wonder he was stuck all the way out here. It's a hike, Tanza continued. Take you a day by skimmer, but I'd be real surprised if you got any of the local traders to rent you one if you tell them that's where you're going. The weather's gone crazy in the last few days. It's been calm for months, but now we're seeing storms big enough to destroy cities. Never seen anything like it. Trask nodded. Okay. Thanks for the intel. No problem. Tanza took a step back and saluted to Trask as he and Peavy passed. Trask nodded his thanks. Decorum dictated that he should have returned the salute, but it had been a very long time since that gesture had had any meaning for him. Trask and Peavy left through the heavy blast doors of the spaceport, and they hissed closed behind them. The street outside was like any other colony town on the outer worlds. 20 or 30 prefab buildings landed from orbit when the world had first been colonized, spread outwards from the spaceport, and at least twice that many buildings grew around them, jerry-built from salvaged container parts and other detritus. There were a couple of skimmers along the street, and a heavy authority tank was parked outside the spaceport. 2 thick-bodied animals with blue hides and disproportionately long snouts pulled carts decorated with arcane symbols in the distance. Local beasts of burden. A Codraw had 4 major cities with populations of millions each, but those were on the other side of the planet. Here, it was still a makeshift town. That was less troublesome than I expected, Major, Peavy. Trask nodded. See if you can get a lock on the pod. If the storm's moved, it will make it hard to track the orbit. As they had entered a Codra's atmosphere, Trask and Peavy had launched a small pod containing all the tools they would prefer not to explain to the customs officer at the gate when they landed. It was cloaked to avoid detection by anyone else, which would not ordinarily cause them any difficulty. A Codra's atmosphere was flat with little disturbance, or at least it should have been. To their surprise, there had been a large electrical storm moving towards the area when they passed. I will locate it, Peavy said. What are you going to do? I'm going to find us a skimmer. Pulling his cloak forward to cover his face, Trask moved along the street towards the row of parked skimmers. The building had a sign on the front reading, Gideon's Skimmers. It had clearly begun life as a prefab dome, but the entry airlock had been removed, and windows had been cut on either side of the archway left behind. These prefab units were designed for use on any world, including those without atmosphere, so they were all fitted with an airlock and were sealed without ventilation. Akodra's atmosphere was heavy and uncomfortably dry, but it was breathable, so the prefab done had been modified accordingly. Further modifications had been made inside, with the atmosphere generator removed and additional walls added. The area inside the archway had been converted into a shop, with a counter made from the remains of storage containers and seats that looked like they had come from a passenger transport. Standing behind the counter was a Shtu. The alien was bipedal, but unnaturally thin and tall. Most of its body was hidden beneath a dull grey cloak, but its smooth, elongated head was visible. The ovular eyes were large and pupilless, and they stared at Trask unblinkingly. Around its neck hung a complicated necklace of bones and hair. "I need a skimmer," Trask said. 4 days, no longer." The alien nodded once, then turned and walked gracefully to a curtained-off door behind the counter, without saying a word. "What is it?" grunted a voice behind the curtain, and there was a low, guttural mumble in response. A grimy, overweight man pushed through the curtain and moved behind the counter. "Sorry," he said to Trask, giving him a greasy smile. "Lousy stew are too damn stupid to deal with anything on their own." The alien followed behind the man, but gave no reaction to the insult. Nor did Trask. "Name's Gideon," the man said, holding out a greasy-looking hand. Trask ignored it. "I need a skimmer," Trask told him. 4 days. "Won't be any longer." "Yeah. What are you using it for?" "Business," Trask said. "Mine. There won't be any risk of damage to it." Gideon frowned. "Where you taking it?" "Who well," Trask said. Gideon shook his head and gave Trask a sneer. "No freaking way. There's winds out there big enough to bury a city at the moment. You go out there, and you ain't coming back. And nor is a skimmer." "There's a Keller 600 out there with shot couplers," Trask said, unsurprised by the response. "I'll give you 3,000 for it." Gideon raised his eyebrows in surprise, his eyes widening slightly. "You want to buy it?" Trask nodded. The man considered. 6,000, he said. 4, Trask counted. 5,000, Gideon said. Trask reached into his cloak and produced 4 credit chips. He dropped them on the counter. 4. Gideon covered the chips with one podgy hand, and quickly swept them off the counter into his other hand. "All right, mister. You bought yourself a skimmer. But if you're going out to the well while the winds are up, you're crazy." Trask said nothing, but held his hand out for the activation crystal. The fat man reached below the counter and handed it to him. Trask turned to the alien, who was still standing behind Gideon near the curtain. He lifted his hand to his forehead. Stu had only 3 digits, so Trask held his middle and ring fingers together and splayed out the other 2, folding his thumb under his palm as he touched his forehead. "Kayesh," he said, "please forgive my pronunciation. It is difficult to form your words with only one tongue. I am named Trask. May I know your name?" "His name is Nobody's Damned," began Gideon, but Trask stabbed the index finger of his free hand towards Gideon's face without looking at him, and the fat man fell silent. The alien looked at Trask for a moment. "My people call me Shadow of the Moons on the Sand," said the alien, its voice lisping and clearly struggling to form the sounds of a language alien to it. "I am pleased to know you, Shadow of the Moons on the Sand," Trask said. "Please forgive my presence in your home. I have work I must complete here and will leave as soon as I am able. I will disturb nothing while I am here." The alien stared at him without blinking, giving no reaction to the formal words of greeting, nor any surprise that Trask knew them or showed him the respect of using them. "Kayesh Trala," Trask said, lowering his hand. He left the building, feeling the eyes of the fat man and the alien on his back. The skimmer vibrated as it moved, at least one of its repulsor motors gone, but it steered well enough. Trask drove it back to the spaceport, where Peavy was waiting. "A wonderful choice of vehicle, Major," Peavy said, as he swung his long skeletal legs into the skimmer beside Trask. "It may even make it to the edge of town." "Wasn't a lot of options. What about the pod?" "I have begun its descent. We can collect it 4 kilometers from the city. Far enough away to avoid detection." Trask nodded, unsurprised by Peavy's efficiency. He headed the skimmer towards the end of the street that led out into Akodra's shifting blue desert, and accelerated as they left the confines of the settlement. Standing by the alien beasts that pulled the carts, two long-limbed Shtu followed the skimmer with their ovular, unblinking eyes, watching it as it passed into the desert that had once been their home. The town sat in the middle of a round ridge of dunes that offered some protection from the continual wind that carried the blue sands of Akodra. Steel posts had been placed to mark the outer edge of the town. Once the skimmer cleared the posts and left the relative protection of the township, the wind increased sharply. So did the blue dust in the air. The front screen of the skimmer was assaulted by the airborne grit, and the vehicle's ventilation system increased in volume as its badly worn motors began to filter the air. In the near distance was a ridge of blue dirt, lined with a row of asymmetrical pillars stabbing into the air. "Over that way, Major," Peavy said, pointing. Trask steered the skimmer towards the ridge, listening to the worn-out repulsor lift's howl. The pod landed minutes before Trask pulled the skimmer over the ridge, Peavy tracking its descent from orbit. Trask pulled the vehicle over, turning it into the wind to provide some protection, as he and Peavy got out and walked over to the pod. Crouching over the long, elongated tube of metal, Peavy tapped the security code into the magnetic lock. It clicked open and Peavy pulled the pod open along the seam, then unzipped the long canvas bag inside it. Trask and Peavy both replaced the stun pistols in their holsters with heavy-caliber blasters from the bag. The bag was only about 2 meters long, but guns and ammunition were heavy. Taking an end of the pod each, they lifted it into the back of the skimmer's cargo tray and covered it with a blanket. They had planned to bury the pod, but the winds would do the job for them in minutes, so they left it. As Trask turned the skimmer towards Kuir's well, the wind began to rise and the sand hissed against the side of the skimmer. A storm was coming. Chapter 2. "Kira, you have to get back here now," Helsa yelled over the communicator, his voice rising in desperation. "Now, Kira. Kira." As she passed by the table, Kira switched the communicator off. She'd already made it clear that she was not returning to the main dig site yet. Helsa seemed to be having difficulty understanding that, and she had more urgent things to do than listen to his hysterics. Kira quickly began to clear the table, shifting tools and the artifacts she had begun cleaning. When the second table filled, she began placing things on the floor beside, taking care to keep them in order. This section of the dig was far too important, and if the storm got bigger, it would completely destroy the progress they had made. The team had spent nearly a month, painstakingly uncovering this section of the Shtu citadel from beneath the sands. Even on preliminary scans of the artifacts they had brought up, the section of the citadel they had begun exploring was over 1,000 years old. They had uncovered archaeotech that would completely change their understanding of Shtu history, and Kira was not going to let that be destroyed. Finally, the table was clear, and she was able to pull the anti-static insulation covering from its surface. She pulled a heavy coat on over the top of her clothes, then wrapped the table's cover around her head and face to form a makeshift face covering. She made her way to the entrance to the bunker, and touched the keypad to open the door. As soon as the door began to slide back, the wind howled fiercely, hurling a rain of flying blue grit inside. Kira grunted and squinted hard as the sharp sand stung the exposed part of her face and eyes. She left the bunker and headed out into the storm. It was so severe now that it almost pushed her off her feet. Forced to walk angled into the wind, Kira struggled forward, trying to reach the open hole that formed the entrance to the dig. There were sandstorms on Akodra, but they were usually so mild that they were more irritating than dangerous. She had never seen anything like this. The usually placid surface of the planet had been transformed into a blue haze, a shower of blue sand so thick that it cut visibility down to a couple of meters. A row of plastic shields had been erected around the entrance of the dig to protect it from the sands that blew through the air. For the usual mild storms, this was enough, but it would offer no protection against what was now beginning. Kira pulled at the insulation cloth wrapped around her nose and mouth, trying to make it tighter to keep the sands out, but the wind was so hard now that it provided little protection. She reached the first of the plastic shields. It was bigger than her and heavy, but the wind was blowing against it. She gripped the top in both hands and began to pull it back towards her. With the wind helping, it began to tilt on its base and gravity did the rest. The shield toppled forward, barely missing Kira's legs, and fell across the entrance hole to the dig. Kira straightened up to move to the next shield, and the wind lifted her off her feet. She was actually carried, a couple of meters before she hit the blue sands of a corridor face down. Stunned, she lay there for a moment. The sands began to cover her, and with a feeling of panic, she realized they would completely cover her in seconds if she did not get up. Struggling hard now, Kira managed to get to her knees. She crawled back to the shields, the storm blowing so hard now that it was like being physically attacked. The sand was clawing at her, tugging fiercely at her clothes and face covering, the wind punching against her hard enough to knock her down. It could not have taken her more than a few minutes to reach the shields again, but it felt much longer. Gripping the top of the next shield, she began to pull. This time she barely got it off balance, before the storm pushed it to the ground, lifting it at the same time, so that it only half covered the entrance hole when it landed. Biting sand was already being blown into the entrance, destroying the section of the citadel they had uncovered. Kira tried to push the shield back into place over the hole, but it was impossible. The wind was far too fierce now, and it was impossible to move the shield. She turned back to the row of shields, planning to topple another over the hole. As she turned her head, the wind lifted the first of the shields, whipping it through the air towards her. She barely had time to duck before the large plastic rectangle scythed across the ground with a screaming howl, missing her by centimeters. Kira lay on the ground again, too stunned to move. All that work. Months of painstaking excavation and delicate work. Everything would be lost, and there was nothing she could now. Nothing at all. Almost weeping at the loss, Kira pushed herself to her knees again. There was nothing to do but return to the bunker and wait out the storm. The wind was so strong now that she was unable to stand. Instead, she crawled across the ground back towards the bunker. Her knee disappeared under her and she fell. Clawing at the ground, she rolled the left, freeing herself. With a shock, she realized she had reached the entrance hole to the excavation again. She had been moving in the wrong direction. She felt a sudden stab of terror run through her, as she discovered how completely disoriented she now was. Which way was the bunker? Kira collapsed on the ground, with no idea at all where she was. If she moved in the wrong direction, she would be crawling further from the bunker and would die in the storm. But if she remained here, she would die just as quickly. She moved her head slowly around, trying to find a shape in the storm, but all she could see was flailing blue sand. The bunker could be anywhere. Forcing herself to move, Kira began crawling in what she hoped was the right direction. But she knew that she'd guessing. The chances of her finding it now were almost nil. She would die here in the storm. The storm lifted her off the ground, turning her in the air before dumping her back on the ground again. She tried to lift her head, but it was too hard. The sand began to build around her, rapidly turning into a blue mound that covered her legs and then her chest. As it began to cover her face, she lost consciousness. "Another 10 units might kill her, Major," whispered a humming sing-song voice from the dark, so faint that it was almost impossible to make out. "She'll die without it," hissed another voice, harder, gruffer. Flaring agony lit up her arm, and Kira tried to scream but no sound came. The pain burned up her arm and through her shoulder. Then it hit her chest. Kira shuddered, her shoulders lurching into the air as her body convulsed. "Easy," grunted the harder voice, "easy. Don't move." Powerful hands gripped her shoulders, pushing her back down and holding her there, as she spasmed. Kira turned her head and vomited explosively, blue sand and bile hemorrhaging from her lungs. The hands turned her to the side, then held her firmly in place. A flood of foul vomit spattered against the floor, followed by another. When the convulsion passed, Kira collapsed onto her back. For a moment she lay there, unable to move. "Her pulse is too fast, Major. We have to bring it back down." "No. Just wait." "Major. Wait." The voices were louder now, and Kira could hear them more clearly. After a moment, she forced her eyes open. A man with a worn, brutal face leaned over her, his hands still on her shoulders. Behind him was another face, impossibly smooth, with features so vague as to be nearly opaque. The man leaning over her gripped her chin with one hand, holding it in place. He placed the other over the side of her head, lifting her eyelid with the ball of his thumb, and peering at her heavily dilated pupil with a frown of concern. Kira tried to speak, but she could not. Her throat burned as she sucked in air. "Lie still, girl. You're safe now." Kira lost consciousness again. When Kira came to again, there was a dull glow in the dark. She lay there for a moment, unable to understand what she was seeing. With a sudden flare of clarity, the memories returned. The storm being lost, feeling the sand covering her. She realized that she was inside the bunker. The power was out, but the room was lit with the faint, dull glow of the lights from the emergency battery. By the entranceway, she could see a man sitting on the ground, his back against the wall of the bunker. He was heavily built, his shoulders pushing out the edge of his cloak. His eyes were closed, but somehow his face still looked alert, ready. "You're awake," said a voice from beside her, its voice carrying the unmistakable tones of an android. As the ando leaned over her, Kira could see its rubber face, its eyes glowing faintly from teardrop-shaped sockets. The ando was old, older than any she had seen, still operational. "How?" she managed to gasp. "Major Trask and I detected your heat signal in the storm. We altered our course towards you and found you buried outside. Would have died without you." "Yes," the android said, its sing-song voice displaying no emotion at all, simply stating a fact. "Our finding you in time was an event so unlikely that it is almost difficult to comprehend." "Thank you," Kira said. She turned her head to look at the big man, who was still sitting against the wall. His eyes were open now, looking at her, but his expression remained blank and unfathomable. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "I'm Trask. This is Peavy. What's your name?" "Kira. Kira Luton." She swallowed, frowning at the pain, then cleared her throat. "I'm a professor of alien archaeology from Gress Central University." "And what are you doing out here all alone?" he asked. "There's a team of us excavating an ancient Shtu citadel. The main dig site is about 20 clicks from here, but we located this section nearer to the surface and opened it about a month ago." She suddenly remembered that the storm was filling the entrance and destroying the dig. Was the entrance to the dig covered? Trask frowned slightly. "There's nothing out there now but sand." Kira groaned. This site was so valuable. We were finding things here that completely changed our understanding of Shtu history. "So dig it up again. The storm will pass." It was protected because it was sealed. With the entrance open, the storm will have destroyed so much. The finds we were making were invaluable. Trask pushed himself to his feet, clearly losing interest in the conversation. "Then find something else. This main dig site of yours. How many people there?" "6 of us from the university. And a security team." Trask raised an eyebrow. "Why do you need a security team?" "The Shtu are passive." Kira noticed that his jaw hardened slightly at the word passive, but the university would not take any chances with its staff. "How big's the security team?" "Just 2 Marines." Trask nodded. "All right. The worst of the storm seems to have passed, but there'll be more on the way. We should move." He turned to a large bag by the door and began closing it. Kira frowned. "Pass so quickly?" But the storm was so big. Peavy looked down at her. "I am afraid you have been unconscious for almost a day." Kira looked at him with surprise. The android put his hands on her shoulders and gripped them. Pulling gently, he eased her into a sitting position. "Come. Let me help you to stand." There should have been enough power from the emergency battery to open the doors to the bunker, but the motors whined loudly, and the doors barely moved. Trask and Peavy stood on either side and pushed their hands through the tiny gap. Both straining hard, they pulled at a door each. With effort, the doors inched open. It quickly became apparent why the doors were not open. as blue sand began to cascade into the bunker. The wind had half buried the bunker, and there was at least a meter of sand piled up against the outside. Once the doors were open enough to let them squeeze through, the three of them climbed over the sands and outside. The area around them was flat and blue, an endless field of tranquil sand bathed in a dull twilight by Kodra's distant sun. There was no hint of the ferocity of the storm that had passed. And no hint of the entrance to the dig either, Kira realized with a bitterness that was so hard it was painful. She felt the tears prickling at her eyes but fought them back. Barely protruding from the blue mound beside the bunker was the top of Kira's skimmer. She could see the top of another beside it, which must have belonged to Trask and the Ando, equally buried. PV lifted his wrist and checked a scanner mounted there. He found the small heat signature of the main dig site. He turned to face Kira. "You said your main site is 20 clicks from here?" "About that," Kira said. "Maybe 6 hours on foot," he said to Trask, who nodded. "At least that," Kira said, "but surely we could dig out one of the skimmers." "It'd take us longer than 6 hours," Trask said, "and I'd be surprised if we could get either of them functional again without stripping them down." He looked up at the sky, turning his head slowly from one side to the other. "What do you think, PV?" he asked. "No sign of another storm now, Major, but the atmosphere is unpredictable." Trask nodded. "Then let's not waste time." He pulled the hood of his cloak up over his head and began walking. PV hefted the large bag over his shoulder, settling the weight into place, and began to follow. "What's in the bag?" Kira asked as she fell into step beside PV. "The tools of our trade," PV said. Interlude 2. 1 week ago. As the scraping from the dais grew louder, blue light began to wash through the room, pale at first, then brighter. "My God," Tui whispered. "No," Klaus said, the side of his face bathed in the blue light as he continued to trace his fingers over the inscriptions, "Theirs." The burning smell was much more potent now, and Tui could see faint hints of smoke rising from beneath Klaus's fingertips. Klaus seemed not to notice, but the heat from the slab was much stronger now in the stark cool of the subterranean tomb. For long minutes, Klaus traced over the hieroglyphics on the slab, his fingertips blackening as he continued. Long tendrils of smoke drifted up from his hand, and the blue light grew brighter. Finally, he reached the bottom of the slab. The sound of scraping stopped. With a look of grim determination, Klaus straightened up and turned towards the dais. Tui forced himself to turn too. The round top of the dais had opened up, like the petals of some ancient stone flower. 8 wedge-shaped pieces had risen vertically, and now stood perpendicular to the floor. From the center of the dais rose a column of blue light, too bright to look at directly. Milner and Jakob stood beside another of the slabs, staring transfixed at the dais. Klaus stepped forward towards the light. "Kluish traghu gauhush kelshatuish," he intoned, his voice echoing loudly in the narrow confines of the room. Tui understood some of the words, but others were indecipherable to him. "Call you," he muttered. "Call who?" "Kluish traghu gauhush kelshatuish," Klaus repeated, his voice growing harsher, more demanding. "Kluish traghu gauhush kelshatuish." "Professor," Tui said, "maybe we should." "Be silent," Klaus spat at him. "Kluish traghu gauhush kelshatuish," he said again. "Kluish traghu." Klaus's voice trailed off as the column of blue light flickered, its brightness wavering. Something dark moved within. A shadow shuddered across the base of the column of light, moving slowly like the dunes of blue sand outside being blown by alien winds. Then it flicked back the other way, faster now. A tendril rose from the bottom of the dais, rising up in the light, followed by another and a third. "No," Tui gasped. Between the tendrils rose a domed shape. The blue light dimmed as it lifted from the darkness, and rose higher through the center of the dais. As the shape came to rest, Tui squinted hard, peering through the light. It was a head, he realized, but a head that was unnaturally elongated and painfully misshapen. Almost as soon as the realization struck him, eyes at the front of the head opened, pupilless orbs staring outwards without blinking. "It's a shtu," Tui muttered. But it was unlike any shtu he had ever seen before. The shtu of this world were bipedal and roughly human in shape, although taller and thinner, with disproportionate limbs and torsos. But the thing inside the dais was squatter, thicker, and had tendrils where legs should have been. The thing inside the dais lay still, its blank eyes staring at nothing. Kluish trag hu gauhush kelsh shatuush, Klaus said again, gusht kala keshestu trauk. Sheshentu kult stesh klagu sheshentu. Sheshentu shihush tra taula kelsht. Klaus's voice continued, intoning the harsh syllables of an alien language that had been dead for over 2,000 years. Tui struggled to translate it, stumbling over terms that he had never before heard, but recognizing enough to gain some understanding of what the professor was saying. Give me the forbidden knowledge, Tui made out. I demand what is mine by right. What the hell did it mean? And how could Klaus speak a language so ancient with such obvious fluency? None of this made any sense. Klaus's voice continued, but the thing inside the dais sat there unmoving, giving no response. Tui's fear grew. He could not understand what was happening here, but he knew it was wrong, dangerous. Backing slowly away from Klauser, he edged between the slabs and back towards the entrance to the tomb. Dim light from outside fell through the slab they had cut through, and Tui hurried towards it. He fumbled at the anti-grav suspensor on his belt, flicking it to the on position. As Tui began to rise up from the dusty floor of the tomb, he turned back towards the dais. The thing inside was still unmoving, and Klaus's voice still droned on. Suddenly, the light above him dimmed. In a panic, Tui flicked his head upwards. Impossibly, the stone slab above him had been sealed, the hole cut through its center blocked by the section that had been removed, as though it had never been cut away at all. He whimpered slightly, as the suspense's energy faded and he sank back down to the floor. Klesh tau gar shatul gu kelsh shatu, Klaus demanded, his voice growing harder. Gu kelsh shatu, said another voice, low and rumbling. With a start, Tui realized it was the thing in the dais speaking, its voice desiccated from 2,000 years of disuse. Klugar tuish, Klaus said. There was silence. For long moments nobody spoke, and there was nothing but painful fear in the tomb. Then the thing in the dais spoke again. But this time its words were not in the dead words of an ancient language. There will be a price, the things croaked, its words heavily accented but understandable. Klaus smiled, a corpse's rictus grin. Of course, he agreed. Chapter 3. It took them nearly 7 hours to reach the main dig site. PV kept them on track by following the heat source, as they trekked across the featureless blue dunes of Akodror. They took regular breaks, but this was for Kira's benefit. PV needed no rest, and Trask seemed able to keep up a steady, relentless march without difficulty. The wind began to pick up after the first 4 hours, and Kira feared it was another storm beginning. She and Trask both wrapped their faces with fabric as the blue grit began to fly, but the wind did not rise particularly high and fell again after a half hour. Akodra's deserts consisted of endless miles of featureless dunes. Everything looked the same. So it came with some surprise to Kira when they crested one dune, and the row of bunkers lay beyond. Trask had been in the lead, but had stopped at the top of the dune to allow Kira to catch up with him. As he waited for Kira to reach the top of the dune, he looked over the dig site. A dozen prefab domes like those that formed the town near the spaceport were arranged in a curving line. 2 large military skimmers were parked beyond these, sheltered from the blowing sands by heavy-duty tarpaulins that were draped across them, and beside them was an industrial digger sitting low on its caterpillar treads. Immediately behind the row of bunkers was the area the team was excavating. 3 holes had been dug in the sands of the desert, and these were surrounded by a row of plastic shields to protect the holes from the shifting sands. Long electrical cables snaked from 2 of the prefab domes across the blue sands and disappeared into the excavation holes. When the girl reached him, they began to trek down the side of the dune towards the bunkers. A colonial marine wearing body armor was standing by the edge of the bunkers. As the 3 of them approached, he touched a button on his wrist, activating the communicator inside his helmet. Then he lifted the rifle that was hanging over one arm and held it across his belly in a ready position as he watched them approach. By the time the 3 of them reached the edge of the site, the marine had been joined by another, this one wearing a sergeant's insignia on his chest plate, and a man in civilian clothes. "Kira!" the man shouted as he rushed towards them. He was probably about 40 and overweight, thick glasses on his nose and a wispy beard across his chin. "Are you okay?" As he reached them, he gripped Kira by the shoulders, looking her over, then pulled her to his chest and hugged her. "My God. We thought you were dead. The storm was so big." "I'm fine, Helsa," Kira said, hugging him back. "I'm fine." Gently, she pushed the man away from her and held him by the upper arms. "I'm fine," she said again, "although I nearly wasn't. If Mr. Trask hadn't found me, I'd have been buried." Turning to look at Trask, the man Helsa smiled gratefully. "Mr. Trask? Thank God you were there." Helsa took a step towards Trask and reached out a hand to him. "Stop!" shouted the sergeant from behind them, and Helsa jumped with shock. His smile disappeared as he turned back towards the Marines. The sergeant strode towards them, flanked by the other Marine, who still held his rifle across his belly. Trask watched them impassively as they approached, careful to remain completely still. The sergeant reached them and stood in front of them. "Sergeant Haldeman. I'm in charge of security at this site." "You are?" Trask said. "What are you doing out here, Mr. Trask?" "I'm a tracker." A sneer appeared on the sergeant's face. "Of course you are," Haldeman said. "A TLC agent? You're a long way from the spaceport, Mr. Trask." Trask nodded. "So I ask again, what are you doing out here?" "I have a warrant to execute." With slow and measured movements, Trask reached for the front of his cloak and held the edge between finger and thumb. He gently eased it aside. As the cloak parted, Trask's holster came into view. "I'll take that," Haldeman said, reaching for the blaster. "No," Trask said, catching his wrist with his free hand. Haldeman tried to snatch his hand free, but Trask held it. The other Marine snapped his rifle into position, training it on Trask. "Please lower your weapons," Peavy said, his sing-song voice humming through the still air. Though nobody had seen him move, Peavy now held a blaster in each hand, one trained on the Marine, the other trained on the sergeant. He had moved to stand on the dune behind Kira and Helsa, their bodies now shielding him, but still allowing him a clear field of fire. For a long, dangerous moment, nobody moved. "Here's what's going to happen," Trask said, his voice even and raised slightly so that everyone could hear it. "I'm going to let go of your arm. You're going to slowly lower your arm and take a step back. Then you're going to tell your man to stand down, and my android will do the same. Everybody is going to stay calm, and nobody is going to get hurt." For a moment, Haldeman did not move. He stared at Trask, a slight twitch in the corner of one eye. Then he nodded, and splayed out the fingers on the hand held by Trask. Slowly, Trask let go of Haldeman's wrist and he took one step back. "Stand down," Haldeman said. The Marine lowered his rifle, and held it across his belly once more. Peavy lowered the twin blasters and slid them into holsters inside his cloak. "I am responsible for the safety of all these people. You appear from nowhere and you're armed. You can understand my concern. Will you give me your weapons?" "No," Trask said evenly, "we won't. I understand your position, Sergeant. But if we had intended you harm, we would not have rescued the girl, and we would not have approached your site visibly." Haldeman thought about this for a moment, then nodded. "No, you would not," he conceded, "but I still don't understand why you're all the way out here. You can't have simply stumbled across Kira by chance." "We didn't," Trask said. "We saw the heat source and followed it to the bunker she was in. It was chance that we found her as the storm hit, but not chance that we were headed in her direction. We were on our way here." Haldeman frowned. "Why?" "That will make more sense when you read the warrant." Haldeman looked at him for a moment longer. "All right. You'd better come inside." The first of the bunkers seemed to be set up as some kind of meeting room or mess hall. Rows of chairs were arranged in a loose circle around one of the room, and there were cooking facilities and food supplies stacked against the wall behind. The other end of the room held a couple of desks and scientific equipment that Trask did not recognize. "Please take a seat," Haldeman said, pointing towards the chairs. The sergeant moved across to the far side of the room and began a huddled conversation with the other Marine. Trask counted the chairs as he walked towards them. 8. Haldeman and the Marine made 2. Kira and Helsa brought the number up to 4. There would be no point setting up more chairs than they needed, so 4 people were missing, including the target. Trask found a chair with its back to the wall and sat in it. PV sat beside him, out of convention rather than necessity. Kira sat near them, but left a few empty chairs between them. Trask glanced briefly at her. She was now looking at him with a kind of wariness. Given the near miss that she had had at the other bunker, it was hardly surprising that she was not thinking clearly, but Trask was vaguely surprised that she had not thought to wonder what he and Peavy were doing all the way out here before now. Clearly it was only when Haldeman had asked that she had realized it was not mere chance, and now that she had learned he was a tracker and had a warrant, she was treating him with some caution. Not Helsa though. "I want to thank you, Mr. Trask," he said, standing in front of Trask and smiling again. "We all thought Kira was gone. You have no idea how relieved we are to find out that she's alive. And she's alive because of you. Thank you." Trask nodded. "It was lucky we arrived when we did." "It sure was," Helsa agreed. "Can I get you a drink or something to eat?" "Water, if you can spare it." "Of course." Helsa moved across to the kitchen facilities and returned with a plastic cup of water. As he took the cup, Haldeman approached him. "I'm afraid we'll have to talk later, Mr. Trask," he said. "A situation has arisen. After the storm that hit Bunker 4 where Kira was working died down, 2 Marines went to assess the situation. They have not returned, and we have now lost contact with them." Trask kept his face impassive but felt unease at that. The storm had gone, and it would take little more than an hour to make the trip there and back by skimmer. "We have another site too," Haldeman continued, "Bunker 6, which is being worked by our team's leader, Professor Clauser. We have just lost contact with them too." "What?" Kira said. Haldeman looked at her. "There's no need for alarm, Kira. The storm was in the other direction, near Bunker 4. Their site was well out of range." Haldeman lifted one hand and rubbed it nervously across his jaw. "Losing contact with both of them at once is weird though." "Sure is," Trask agreed. "I'm assuming atmospheric disturbance caused by the storm is interfering with our comms, so there's no need for concern at this point. But I'm going to have 2 men sent to Professor Clauser's bunker to see what the situation is." Trask thought that explanation highly unlikely, particularly if the storm was nowhere near Professor Clauser's location, but he said nothing. "I'm going to contact my superiors to make a report," Haldeman said, "and get further orders. In the meantime, I'll trust you to remain here. I'm doing this only because we owe you Kira's life, so I have to assume that you mean us no harm. Can I ask you to give me your word that you will remain in the company of Kira or Helsa, and cause no problems?" Trask nodded. "You have my word." Haldeman nodded, giving him a brief smile of thanks and turned on his heel. Trask watched him go. Any officer that was prepared to give 2 armed strangers the run of the place, and leave them with the archaeologists he was supposed to be protecting, without even properly exploring the reason for their presence, shouldn't be in charge of security. Clearly, nobody in command thought the site was in any real danger if they'd given Haldeman control of it. Kira closed her eyes and pushed her arms and legs out, stretching. "Gods, I'm so tired," she said. "Walking all the way here from Bunker 4? Helsa said. "I'm not surprised. That's a hell of a trek." Kira nodded. "I'm going to wash and get some sleep." She stood to leave, staring at Trask for a moment but saying nothing. After a moment, she left the dome. "Do you know anything about the natives of this planet?" Helsa asked, sitting down again with a drink of his own. "Not much," Trask lied. "The Shtu occupy most of the habitable worlds in this solar system," Helsa said, sipping his drink. "They have a technology that is completely different to ours, and we're still struggling to understand it. They haven't offered us much help in figuring it out, but they're not hostile towards us and haven't caused us any trouble." Few slaves do, Trask thought, but said nothing. This world, a Kodraw, although that's our name of course not theirs, seems to hold one of their oldest civilizations. 3 of their cities remain in use towards the equator, but they were clearly built relatively recently, maybe 5 or 6 generations ago. Beneath the surface though there's more, much more. Helsa sipped his drink again. We've located ruins of whole cities beneath the surface. This is the first of those that we've begun to excavate, but it won't be the last. The archaeotech we've already found is completely changing our understanding of the Shtu. How so? Trask asked. Helsa paused and took a breath, trying to think of some way to simplify this. The technology used by modern Shtu is curious. We barely understand its functioning, but it works along the same lines as our own, just much more advanced. But what we're finding in the ruins here is different. The ancients seem to have had some way of harnessing the natural forces of the planet and using it for their own means. The archaeotech is almost organic in some ways, ways that we can't yet understand. It's like magic in a way. Helsa gave a grin of embarrassment. I said something like that to Professor Klaus when we first began to uncover it. He told me to stop talking like a child. Where is he, Professor Klauser? Trask asked. Sergeant Haldeman said he was working at another dig site. That's right, Helsa said. Bunker 6. We found maps of the citadel out here. Helsa nodded his head towards the excavation site outside the prefab domes, and they suggested there was a tomb for one of the ancients further out from here. It took us a few days to decipher the ancient text, but we worked out the location eventually. Professor Klaus and 3 of our team went out to investigate a while ago. What did they find? Trask asked. Helsa frowned, his smile disappearing. Well, we don't know actually. They haven't returned from the site, and when we have been able to contact them on the communicator, the professor has been very tight-lipped about what they've found. Hasn't anyone else been out there? No, the storms have prevented us going out to the site. Helsa's frown increased. Actually, the storms began the same day that the professor and the others went out to the site. They've increased steadily ever since. Chapter 4. Helsa led Trask and PV out of the dome and across the blue sand. They passed the row of habitation domes and walked towards the one at the end. Helsa put his hand on the touchpad beside the door, and it whispered open. With a slightly nervous smile, he stepped to the side and waved them in. The inside of the dome was tidy, but there was a fine carpet of blue grit across the floor. Unshielded bulbs provided pockets of harsh light. One end of the dome contained a couple of desks and some laboratory equipment. The other had a row of bunks. Normally, I share this with 3 of the others, Helsa said, but they're away with the professor, so I've been on my own for the last week. Feel free to rest here. Thanks, Trask said. I brought up a couple of statuettes yesterday that I've been cleaning. He pointed at one of the desks at the other end of the dome. I'm going to do some more work on cleaning and cataloging these. I'll try to keep the noise down. Don't worry too much. I've slept in much noisier places. I'll bet. Helsa headed for the other end of the dome and sat at one of the desks. When Helsa had offered Trask somewhere to rest, Trask had agreed mainly because he wanted some time away from the man and his endless talking. But now that he sat on the edge of the bunk, Trask found he was actually quite tired. There was a time when he had been able to march a full day without difficulty, but those years were gone. He was getting older, and he knew it. In any event, there was little else he could do for now, and it made sense to rest while he could. Trask had spent most of his life at the sharp end, and had learned long ago to trust his instincts. He was feeling a familiar uneasiness, and although he didn't yet know why, he knew this was going to be more difficult than a simple track locate capture job. Anything that needs doing, Major? PV asked. Trask shook his head. Keep an eye on the storm, but otherwise we wait. Trask lay on the bunk, pulling his cloak around him. He lay on his left side, protecting his heart, and with his forearm across his chest, holding the handle of his blaster. Old habits. Old habits that he had learned in another place. As Trask began to drift, memories surfaced. The insects were the worst. It never stopped raining on Gottrell, and it was uncomfortably hot even during the night. The humidity was supposedly 80 or 90%, so they all sweated constantly, drenching their combat fatigues and making them chafe. Some of the others kept only their armor and cut off sleeves or trouser legs to avoid the chafing, but that just gave the insects more exposed flesh to attack. Trask kept his fatigues intact, deciding the irritation of wet clothing was more tolerable than the insect bites. The insects must have had a name, but nobody knew what it was. They were the length of a thumb, but narrower, and had a complicated arrangement of wings unlike anything they had seen before. Their stings were small, barely more than a nuisance, but when they stung 100 times a day, all day, every day, a nuisance quickly became torture. It was like being constantly needled without respite. After the last barrage of enemy fire, the rest of the unit had become separated. Maybe the others had survived the blast. Maybe they had not. That was 5 days ago. Now it was just the 6 of them remaining. And the aliens. The locals on Gottrell looked like some kind of insects too. Adapted to live in the wet and humid climate of Gottrell, they had tiny stunted legs ending in webbed pads and long hunched torsos. Their long limbs had several joints, and their round segmented eyes took up much of their face. Their skin was rubbery and coarse, reptilian. And the 7 of them had been resting when the remains of the unit had stumbled across them. They had been taken prisoner without effort. Brel was ranking officer, at least until they rejoined the rest of the unit, and he had decided they would hold the aliens prisoner until the rest of the unit could be found. But after 5 days, it was starting to become clear that they may never find the others. It was also starting to become increasingly clear that Brel was going crazy. "We need information," Brel said. The constant drumming of the rain and the constant buzz of the insects made it difficult to hear each other clearly, but the note of madness in his voice was clear enough. The others exchanged glances. "They don't speak, sir," Jilk pointed out nervously. "They haven't spoken since we found them, and that was days ago." "Then we make them speak," Brel said. "Line them up." Nobody moved. "Sir," one of the others began nervously. "That's an order," Brel screeched. Reluctantly, 3 of the soldiers pushed the aliens to their feet and made them stand in a line. Even the child. Trask watched them. He had avoided antagonizing Brel, as it became increasingly obvious that Brel had slipped to the wrong side of sanity. His strategy, as far as had one, was simply to avoid any contact with Brel and remain in the background. Brel took out his pistol and walked over to stand in front of the first alien. He thrust his face into that of the alien, who blinked several times and flinched back. "The rest of our troops are somewhere," Brel demanded. "Tell me where they are." The alien looked at him. "I don't think he understands you, sir," Jilk said, clearly nervous though brave enough to point this out. "No." Brel said. "Well, let's see if he understands this." He lifted his gun and shot the alien in the head. The retort of the gun was shockingly loud, and a semi-solid mass of brown matter exploded from the back of the alien's head as he fell to the ground. The other soldiers jumped. The rest of the aliens began whimpering. "How about you?" Brel said to the next. "Where are they?" The alien cowered but said nothing. "Even if he could understand you," Huli pointed out, "he may not even know where our troops are, sir. They're just as lost as we are." Brel turned on him. "Be quiet, soldier. Unless you want to join them over here." He turned back to the alien. "Well? Last chance." The alien whimpered but said nothing. Brel shot him through the head. "I'm just not getting through to you, am I?" Brel screamed at the remaining group of aliens. "You don't seem to think I'm serious." Suddenly, he moved along the line to the child. He pushed the barrel of his pistol against the child's forehead, shoving her head back painfully, and held it there. "You think I'm joking?" he screeched at the other aliens, spittle flying from his mouth. "Do you? Speak now or she dies next." "Well?" Brel turned back to look at the child, his finger tightening on the trigger. Trask shot Brel in the back of the head, killing him instantly. "Major," Peavy said beside him, waking Trask. Trask snapped his eyes open, instantly awake, but lay still, assessing the situation. Sergeant Haldeman and the other Marine had entered the dome, with Kira trailing slightly behind them. Helsa rose to greet them and walked across. Haldeman spoke briefly to him, but was too far away for Trask to make out their words. Trask looked at the chronometer on his wrist and was surprised to find that he had slept for almost 4 hours. He stood, tensing and untensing his muscles to wake them, as he watched Haldeman and the Marine approach. Kira and Helsa remained at the end of the dome. "Got some rest?" Haldeman asked. Trask nodded. "Good. I'm afraid there have been some more developments." "What's the situation?" "I told you earlier that I would try to contact command for further orders. I couldn't reach them. Communications are down, so we're cut off. Interference from the storm." This seemed unlikely to Trask, but he said nothing. 2 Marines from the spaceport went out to Bunker 6 to try to locate the Professor's team. They haven't returned and we've lost contact with them too. 2 other men went to Bunker 4 where Kira was working. They haven't returned either. Still uncontactable. Trask considered this for a moment. He turned to Peavy. "Where's the storm?" Peavy reached for the datapad mounted on his wrist and ran his fingers over it a few times. "Between Bunker 4 and here, Major." "Major?" Haldeman asked, but Trask ignored him. "Anything between here and the other dig site?" "No." "The storm may have caught the men at Bunker 4, Sergeant," Trask said, "but it's not why the men at Bunker 6 are not responding. And not why Professor Klaus isn't responding either." "Then what?" Trask shook his head. "There are 2 skimmers covered up outside. Are either of them armored?" "No," Haldeman said, surprised. "No need for it." Trask pointed at the rifle carried by the Marine. "Do you have anything heavier than TR-750s, or is that it?" "That's all we have," Haldeman said, frowning. "Look, just what the hell do you think is out there?" "I don't know any more that you do, Sergeant. But 4 armed Marines have disappeared without any contact in the space of a few hours. Assume there's a hostile force until we learn otherwise." Haldeman looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," Haldeman said, "what do you suggest?" "I need to find out what's happening at the dig site where Professor Klaus is. I'll need one of your skimmers." "Very well. Peavy, run diagnostics on one of the skimmers. And make sure it's fully fueled." "Yes, Major." Peavy left the room, hefting the bag over his shoulder and taking it with him. "The Ando keeps calling you Major," Haldeman said. "Are you?" "That was a long time ago." "Then I'm coming with you." "You need to guard the civilians, Sergeant." Haldeman paused, obviously not having thought about this. I'll leave the corporal here. He can keep trying to reach command as well. You should stay here, Sergeant. If we don't return, you can take the others in the 2nd skimmer and return to the spaceport. With the storm between here and the spaceport, we'd never make it. "No, I'm coming with you, Mr. Trask, and that's final. We leave in 1 hour." Haldeman turned on his heel and left the dome. Trask watched him go, wondering what to make of the man. He seemed happy enough to let Trask plan their next move, clearly having no idea himself, but then grew a spine once it had been decided. Trask did not particularly want Haldeman along for the ride, but it seemed he had little choice. As Trask glanced around, he saw Kira approaching with Helsa a few steps behind. Kira had a frown of concern on her face. Helsa looked shell-shocked, his round face clearly showing fear. "Do you really think there's something out there, Mr. Trask?" Kira asked. "Maybe there's another explanation," Trask said, "but I can't think of one right now." She remained standing there. Trask knew what was coming. "When we arrived here, you told Sergeant Haldeman that you were a tracker, and you had a warrant." Trask nodded. "It seems to have slipped his mind with everything else that's going on, so he hasn't asked you. Who is the warrant for?" "Professor Klauser." "What?" Helsa sputtered. "That's insane. Why would anyone put a bounty on the professor?" Kira put a hand on Helsa's arm. She turned back to Trask. Why has someone offered a bounty on Professor Klauser? Last year, the professor was working another excavation on Trilos. Yes, Kira said, another Stu citadel. We knew to dig here on a Codraw, because of the ruins that the professor uncovered on Trilos. 2 other archaeologists were working with him on Trilos. Both died. Helsa scoffed. Part of the excavation collapsed. They were underfunded, and the conditions were poor. It was an accident. Nothing more. Not what the family of one of the other archaeologists thinks. Then what do they think? Kira asked. There was an investigation carried out on Trilos by the colonial governor there, but it was rushed and incomplete, Trask said. He wrote it up as an accident in less than a day. And there's now evidence that a large sum of unexplained credits found their way to him shortly afterwards. You think he was paid off by Professor Klauser? Kira asked. Doesn't matter what I think. But the family of the dead archaeologist thought he was paid off. And they managed to persuade the colonial administration in charge of these colony worlds, because they issued a warrant for Klauser's arrest. That's crazy, Helsa said again. Professor Klaus is one of the most eminent alien archaeologists in the entire solar system. He's been studying the Stu for 30 years. His work has expanded our knowledge of Stu history more than anybody else's has ever done. And he's given me and Kira, all of us, opportunities to do work that none of us could ever have dreamed of. Why would the professor murder 2 members of his team? What reason could he have for that? Maybe he found something on Trilos that he wanted kept secret, Trask suggested. But it's not secret, Helsa persisted. In the ruins on Trilos were journals from a 12th century library telling us the location of the citadel here on a Codraw. That's how the professor knew where to dig. He's never told us exactly what he's looking for, though, Kira said quietly, and he didn't want to take Tui and the other 2 with him to Bunker 6. He only took them in the end, because Tui said they would go there without him. Well, yes, Helsa said, but that doesn't... I mean... He fell silent. He was clearly reluctant to believe any of this, but his face showed that he was starting to join the dots. You don't seem very surprised, Trask said to Kira. I don't know, she said. There was something about the professor that was starting to make me feel, I don't know, uncomfortable. There were things he wouldn't discuss, and we started finding artifacts here at the main dig that he got very excited about but always pretended he wasn't. Kira looked hard at Trask. I don't believe the professor has killed anyone, she said firmly. He's not a murderer. But maybe there's something more to the accident that he hasn't told anyone. Trask shrugged. Then he can explain it, the colonial administration. I'm getting paid to bring him to them, not to find out the truth. So you'll arrest him and take him back to the spaceport? Trask nodded. What happens to the dig after that? Helsa asked. The work we're doing here is so important. We're learning things about the Stu that are invaluable. I don't know, Mr. Helsa. That's not my concern either. All you care about is the money, Helsa sneered. Yes, Trask said bluntly. He looked at them both for a moment longer. Regardless of what Sergeant Haldeman says, if you don't hear from us 2 hours after we leave, you try to reach us on the communicator. If you can't, both of you take the remaining skimmer and return to the spaceport. You'll have to watch the storm and give it a wide bearing to avoid it. Kira nodded. Okay. Near the spaceport, there's a man named Gideon who hires out skimmers. He has a shop across the road from the spaceport entranceway, with a row of broken-down skimmers along the front. I know who you mean. He has a Stu shaman working in his shop, although I doubt Gideon knows that's what he is. When you get back to the spaceport, go to the shop. If the shaman's gone, then you get off-world any way you can. Why? Helsa asked. If the shaman has gone to ground, it's because he's afraid. Afraid of what? Trask looked at him. Of what we're going to find at Bunker 6. Interlude 3. 14 months ago. It had taken the 3 of them almost a fortnight to gain entrance to the main chamber. They had found the entrance to the chamber using ultrasonic imaging, although the equipment didn't function properly here on Trilos. The equipment was designed for the atmospheric conditions of the worlds at the center, and it never worked as it should on worlds with higher gravity and a different chemical makeup in the atmosphere. From the ultrasonic imaging that they could obtain, though, it was obvious that the tunnels leading to the entrance were blocked. Assuming that it was due to a landfall or some kind of earthquake, they had moved slowly at first, shifting the stones aside using the excavators they had brought with them. It was Jelling who first suggested that the tunnel had been deliberately blocked. Klaus and Pell had scoffed at the idea at first, but as they continued, it became apparent that the stones were far too closely packed and too uniform for it to be the result of natural subsidence. Jelling was right. The chamber had been deliberately sealed off. Nobody was meant to uncover whatever was in there. Perhaps this should have caused them to pause and consider the implications of this, but none of them did. Instead, they quickened their pace. No longer concerned about disturbing unstable rubble and causing more subsidence, they began removing the stones in their path with more force and more haste, slowing down only as they reached the entrance. Trilos was horrendously cold, mean temperatures dropping below freezing most of the day, although there was so little moisture in the air that it remained dry. The absence of oxygen in the air meant the three of them were forced to wear face masks and breathing equipment at all times, which added to the discomfort. But that was forgotten, as Pell used the excavator to swing aside the last of the stone blocks covering the entranceway, and they breached the chamber. "Get two of the drones in here," Klaus said, his voice rendered tinny with a slight echo by the communicator inside the face masks, "and turn the lighting up to maximum." The drones carried compressed halogen bulbs which were no bigger than a fist, but bright enough to light up an entire habitation dome. Again, though, they were designed for the atmospheric conditions of the worlds at the center, and not for Trilos. Even at maximum, the lighting from the drones barely pierced the gloom, and provided no more than a dull glow. But despite the poor lighting, it was apparent that the chamber was a ruin. 6 vertical slabs were arranged into a perfect circle in the center of the room. Each of them had been defaced, the hieroglyphics across their faces chiseled and hammered to make them indecipherable. A large dais lay in the center of the 6 vertical pillars, but it too had been destroyed. Its sides had been attacked and smashed, and it lay like an eggshell crushed into broken shards. "It's been desecrated," Jelling said, stating the obvious, "everything destroyed." Jelling's voice was cracking. He was almost in tears at the discovery of the destruction, so much precious knowledge now lost to them. "Who could have done this?" Pell asked. "Tomb robbers." "No," Klaus said, his mind the sharpest as ever, "the entranceway was sealed. Tomb robbers could not have gotten in. This was done deliberately by whoever sealed the tunnel leading here." "The Stu wanted to hide all this," Pell said, realizing the significance of what Klaus was saying. "But why?" Jelling said, his voice higher than normal, "It's criminal. We could have learned so much." Klaus was growing irritated by the man's childish whining, but said nothing. Instead, he stepped forward into the chamber, moving between 2 of the stone slabs. He peered into the darkness. "Surely. Get the drones closer to the center," he said, "there's something here." Pell lifted his wrist and played with the controls along his forearm. Silently, the 2 drones edged between the stone slabs, their bulbs glowing brightly but the light still disappearing into the gloom. But even the dull light cast by the drones was enough. Lying in the center of the smashed dais was a body, its multiple limbs hanging over the broken sides of the stone circle. What had once been flesh was now mummified, desiccated by age. It was only the extreme cold and low oxygen atmosphere that had left anything behind at all after 1,000 years. The elongated skull had been smashed in, one of the eye sockets completely obliterated, and the chest cavity had been opened by some kind of edged weapon. A dozen or more long tendrils that formed the creature's lower limbs had been hacked off and torn into pieces. They lay on the ground, around the ruin of the dais. "What the hell is it?" Pell asked, as he and Klaus peered at the ancient remains. "Look at the shape of the skull and the jaw," Klaus said, tracing them through the air with his finger. "It looks like a Stu. But the limbs and the shape of the torso. We've never seen a Stu like that on any other world." This chamber's perhaps 2,000 years old. They couldn't have evolved into their current form in that time. Some form of mutation, Klaus suggested. Possibly. But what could have caused it? Was it killed because it was different? Is that why the hieroglyphics were defaced too? The two men fell silent, as they looked over the mummified remains before them. They had come here expecting to uncover answers that would expand their understanding to Stu history, and had found more questions instead. Jelling was a xenolinguist, an expert in alien languages. His work in translating the writing of the ancient Stu was unparalleled. Nobody had ever come close to his level of understanding of the ancient writings. Jelling's work had led them to this place, telling them of its existence, but it had not been clear what the purpose of the chamber was. And now they would not find out from the chamber itself. Whatever had happened here, the damage was so extensive that they would never learn the secrets of this place. What do we do? Pell asked. Klaus shrugged. We learn what we can from what is left. In the dim light provided by the drones, the three men began to record and catalogue what was left in the chamber. It became apparent as they continued examining the chamber that the damage was confined to the area in the center of the room between the 6 slabs. Only the faces of the 6 pillars and the dais at their center had been damaged. The rest of the room was untouched. On the third day, Jelling found the concealed doorway. These characters here, Jelling said, gesturing with his hands at the row of hieroglyphics just below the ceiling, they're arcane and I can't quite decipher all of them, but this is a warning. An hour later, as he cleaned around the hieroglyphics in order to record them, he found the hidden switch. With a low hum and a scraping of stone, a section of the wall began to slide inwards on some concealed mechanism. The chamber beyond began to glow from some form of lighting built into the place. Klaus entered first, with the other 2 behind him. What is this place? Pell asked. A storage room. No, Klaus said, it's the library. The library? Pell asked. You were expecting to find this? Klaus ignored him. He picked up a thin steel plate, inscribed with intricate characters from the hundreds that filled one of the shelves in the room, and began to read it. Look at this mural, Pell said, looking over a large carving that covered the wall beside the door. It's a star chart. These are each of the worlds in this solar system. Look, Trilos is here, 6 from the sun. And this symbol above Trilos, Jelling said, childish excitement in his voice, it's the dais and the 6 slabs in the outer chamber, surely. It's telling us it's located here on Trilos. There's another here, Pell said, pointing to another of the planets, and a third. The 4th planet and the 5th, Jelling said, which would mean there are more chambers like this on Akodra and Rylu. What does this say? Pell asked, pointing at the script beneath the star chart. Kulu Guesh Tralalu Karthu Hesh, Jelling read, stumbling over some of the symbols. Kalu Truf Guesh Kardu Hesh. Here lies the bringer of storms, the destroyer of worlds. He looked up at Pell, and the 2 men stared at each for a moment. Jelling turned. Christoph, this is? He expected Klaus to be standing behind them, examining the mural with them. Instead, Klaus was reading over another of the thin steel plates. He seemed oddly disinterested in the mural, as though he had expected to find it here, and was unsurprised by it. What have you found? Jelling asked, walking across to Klaus. Klaus ignored him, but continued to read over the inscribed steel plate. As he read, he muttered under his breath, reading aloud in a dead alien tongue. With a start, Jelling realized that Klaus was translating the slab. He not only understood the script, but his knowledge of it was greater than that of Jelling. Klaus was reading fluently and confidently, pronouncing symbols that Jelling had been unable to translate despite nearly 10 years of research. The script is 12th century, Jelling said, reading over his shoulder. No, Klaus muttered, much earlier. How can you understand these symbols, Christoph? Jelling asked. Klaus ignored him but continued reading. Galugshesh Kallu, Klaus read aloud, Ugar Truglesh Sus. Fear those who seek, Jelling said, translating, within lies the secret of the beyond. Klaus looked up at him and smiled, his eyes alive with madness. Stop it, Jelling said, taking a step back. Put the slate back, Christoph. This is evil. No, this is power, Klaus said. Power undreamt of. Christoph, he's right, Pell said, stepping forward to join Jelling. We need to leave this place. We should think this through before we go any further with this. Run in fear, you mean? Klaus sneered. There is knowledge here that was hidden on purpose, Jelling said, things that were not meant to be found. Maybe it should remain hidden. He's right, Pell agreed, nodding. The ancients sealed this place for a reason. Nobody should know what we found here. Klaus looked at them both, the dull glow of the room casting shadows across his face that made his eye sockets look empty and his grin that of a skull. And nobody shall, Klaus agreed, not until I'm ready to use it. Chapter 5. Even without the heavy plating of armor, the military skimmer was slow to move. At the rate they were traveling, it might take them 2 hours to reach Bunker 6, Trask calculated. Not necessarily a problem if the storm remained on the other side of the dig site, but if it shifted into the same area they were traveling, they would have some serious difficulties. You think my decisions were wrong? Haldeman asked, breaking the silence after the first 40 minutes. He had been growing more skittish as the journey continued, and Trask knew it was coming. Not for me to say, Trask replied. Yes, well, it's very easy to look at tactical decisions made after problems have arisen and say that they were wrong. Unfortunately, officers don't get the luxury of hindsight. Trask said nothing. It's difficult in the field. Nobody understands that unless they've held a command themselves. They drove further in silence. What do you expect we'll find out here? Haldeman said after a while. I don't know. Klaus may have murdered the other archaeologists, but there's... Murdered? Professor Klauser. That's ridiculous. He has a history. That's why I'm here. Your warrant is for Klauser. Yes? There was a silence, while Haldeman absorbed the implications of this. What were you going to say, Mr. Trask? He asked after a moment. Professor Klaus may have murdered the rest of his team at Bunker 6, but what? But I don't think he could have got the jump on 2 armed Marines in body armor. There's something else out here we need to worry about. Like what? I don't know. They drove on in silence. Major, I'm detecting a heat source, Peavy said, his sing-song voice breaking the silence after another 20 minutes, faint but still there. Bearing 639 to our east. Out here? Haldeman asked, turning to Trask. We're only halfway to the bunker. Do you think it's the men from the spaceport? I think we should find out. Haldeman turned the skimmer on an eastwards course, its heavy repulsor fields shifting over the blue sands. Peavy, let us know when we get to 500 meters out. Yes, Major. They drove further. The sand out here was still and undisturbed, tranquil. But there was something about the empty plains, completely devoid of any features or distinguishing marks, that was unsettling. It reminded them how isolated they were in the deserts of Akodror. They were a long way from anywhere else. 500 meters, Major, Peavy said. Stop here, Sergeant, Trask said. Why? Haldeman asked, stopping the skimmer. Because 3 targets are harder than 1. Before they left the main dig site, Peavy had placed the bag they brought with them from the capsule in the back of the skimmer's payload area. He unzipped the top of the bag and folded back the flap. Returning to the main cab, he handed Trask an assault rifle. He held a second himself. What the hell? Haldeman hissed, where did you get those? Give us 10 minutes to fan out, Trask said, ignoring the question, then move forward slowly. If you see anything that looks like hostile activity, move out of range but wait for us. Haldeman nodded, accepting Trask's orders without any resistance. Trask wasn't surprised. Looking at Peavy, Trask pointed to the west of the skimmer. Yes, Major, Peavy said, his long skeletal legs carrying him quickly across the sand in a semi-crouch, the assault rifle cradled across his chest. Trask turned to the east and moved across the sand at a quick trot. There were some low dunes here but no real cover. It would be difficult to stay out of sight, but the skimmer would draw the most attention. And enemy fire. Trask did not, though, expect there to be anything left now. Nothing left alive, anyway. Counting his paces, Trask jogged about 200 meters to the east of the skimmer, then turned to the west, approaching the location of the heat source from one side. Peavy would approach from the other side, while Haldeman in the skimmer approached from the center. As he moved across the blue sands in a crouch, Trask realized he could smell something. There was a metallic odor, like hot metal, and beneath it something else. Something more organic. Something darker came into view, and Trask slowed his pace, watching for movement. From his peripheral vision, he could see the skimmer approach as Haldeman too slowed down. Thumbing the safety catch off the assault rifle, Trask moved it into a ready position, cradling it against his hip as he approached slowly. The sand here was completely smooth but banked around a dark shape. As he moved closer, it became apparent that the shape was the top section of another skimmer poking through the blue sand, the main part of its body almost completely buried. Trask could see nothing around the buried skimmer. No movement and no tracks. Any movement? He muttered into his communicator. Nothing major, Peavy's voice answered. Haldeman stopped his skimmer 20 meters away from the wreckage and got out. Holding his rifle in a ready position, he walked across to join Trask. What's happened to it? Haldeman asked. Another storm. Looks like it, Trask said, but the storm's passed and these men haven't made contact. Then where are they? I don't think they left the skimmer, Trask said. No life signs, Peavy confirmed as he approached them. The heat source is the damaged vehicle only. The side doors of the wrecked skimmer were buried by the piles of sand heaped against it. Haldeman's skimmer carried shovels in the cargo hold and they fetched these. It took them 20 minutes to shift enough sand to uncover one of the doors. Haldeman raised his rifle to cover the door as Trask pulled the handle open. There was no movement, but the unpleasant smell grew stronger. This close, it smelled like burned meat. There was also a distinct heat now, like standing somewhere near the embers of a fire. In the permanent light of a Codra's sun, they could see inside the cabin of the skimmer. The two Marines sat side by side in the cab, both cradling their rifles across their chests. Both were burnt, their bodies blackened and charred, a dull heat still emanating from the corpses. Gods, Haldeman muttered, what kind of weapon did this? Some kind of laser? No, Trask said, not that kind of weapon. What then? I think they've been struck by lightning. Both of them? That's impossible. Look at the hull of the skimmer. The metal scorched, melted in places. Do you know anything else that can do that? And there are no tracks leading up to the skimmer. The ground's been washed smooth by rain. Haldeman stood looking at the wrecked skimmer, trying to comprehend what all this meant. It's impossible, Haldeman muttered again, but there was no certainty in his voice anymore. Major, Peavy said, breaking through the silence, I'm detecting a life sign. Trask and Haldeman both snapped their rifles up into readiness. Where? Trask asked, scanning the dunes for any sign of movement. There, Peavy said, looking up from his wrist scanner. His long skeletal arm pointed across the smooth blue sand at the skimmer they had driven from the dig site. Cautiously, the three of them approached the skimmer, guns at the ready, searching for any movement. Haldeman yanked open the cabin door. Empty. They peered through the payload area at the back. Also empty. On both sides of the skimmer were mounted a row of storage lockers, 6 in all. Haldeman yanked them open one at a time, while Peavy and Trask covered them with their guns. They found her in the fourth. Kira, Haldeman hissed, what are you doing here? Kira swung her legs out of the locker and down onto the blue sand, squinting against the bright light after spending an hour hidden inside the storage compartment. She looked at Trask. You're wrong about Professor Clauser. I need to speak to him to find out what really happened before you take him away. So you stowed away? Haldeman asked. I asked to come. You told me it was too dangerous. Haldeman turned to Peavy. How come you only picked up her life signs now? We've been moving for over an hour. I had no reason to scan the vehicle we were in, Peavy said, and even if I had done so, Sergeant, a scan would have picked up our life signs. I would have had no reason to suspect another was hidden on board. Haldeman looked at Kira for a long moment. She stared back at him defiantly. "It's too dangerous," Haldeman said, turning to Trask. "We'll have to take her back." "No," Trask said, "we keep moving." They returned to the skimmer, Haldeman and Trask in the front seats with Peavy and Kira seated in the row behind them. Haldeman turned the skimmer back onto their original course, and they headed for Bunker 6, leaving the burnt-out skimmer and the 2 dead Marines behind them. The next hour passed uneventfully. 500 meters, Major, Peavy said, as they approached Bunker 6. "Stop here, Sergeant," Trask said, "same drill as before." Haldeman stopped the skimmer. Trask and Peavy got out, fanning out in opposite directions and jogging across the blue sands. Trask noted that there were more dunes, but still very little cover. When he reached about 200 meters out, Trask turned and began approaching the dig site from the side. As he got closer, he could see another of the prefab domes used at the main dig, and at Bunker 4 where he and Peavy had found Kira. A skimmer was parked beside it, seemingly intact, and cabling snaked across the ground to disappear into a hole in the ground which was surrounded by a circle of plastic shields. Trask dropped to his stomach and used the sights of the assault rifle to check over the dig site. The sights magnified everything, giving Trask a closer view of the bunker, the skimmer and their surrounds, but he could see no movement outside. If there was anyone here, they were inside. "No movement from this side, Peavy," he muttered into the communicator. "You?" "No, Major," Peavy replied. "Doesn't appear to be any damage." "I cannot see any damage on this side either, Major." "All right. I'm moving in. You stay put for now and watch." Haldeman stopped the skimmer 100 meters from the bunker and waited. Trask approached the dig site, alert for any movement, but saw nothing as he drew closer. He reached the skimmer as Haldeman and Kira got out. "Can you see anything?" Haldeman asked. Trask shook his head. "Now what?" Haldeman asked. "I'll go and knock. Stay here and keep watch." Trask moved across the sands between the skimmer and the bunker. He held his assault rifle at the ready, but saw nothing. "Professor Clauser," he called as he approached the bunker, "anybody?" There was no reply. Trask crossed the short distance to the door. Still nothing. On the wall of the dome beside the door was a touch-sensitive pad. The doors could be locked with a PIN code, but this one was unlocked. Trask lifted his left hand off the front grip on the assault rifle and touched the pad, then returned his grip to the gun as the door slowly opened. Trask stood to the side of the door to present a smaller target and peered around its edge. No movement inside. Slowly he moved across the doorway, alert for anything, but there was nothing. Checking both blind spots on either side the doorframe, Trask edged inside. The inside of the dome looked much like the sleeping quarters at the main dig. A row of 4 bunks had been set up along one wall. The bedclothes were disturbed, but it did not look like they had been slept in for some time. At the other end of the dome was a desk and several packing crates. A couple were open, but most were still closed. Trask could see ration packs inside one of the open crates, with 20 or 30 missing from the top. A fusion generator hummed gently at the end of the bunker, and 2 power cables coupled to its output sockets snaked across the floor and out through the access hatch beside the doorway. There was nobody inside the dome. "Major," Peavy's voice sounded over the communicator, "I'm detecting storm activity." "How far away?" "Some kilometers, but it's moving fast. At present speed, it will arrive in approximately 27 minutes. Trask paused, considering. "All right, Peavy. There's nobody in the bunker. I'm going to check the excavation. Stay on point for now, just in case. If you don't hear from me in 10 minutes, come looking." "Yes, Major." "I have another thought, Major." "What?" "The storm is likely to interfere with communications. We need not be able to contact each other when it gets closer." Trask cursed, realizing Peavy was right. "Understood. 10 minutes, Peavy." "Yes, Major." Trask left the bunker and returned to the skimmer, where Haldeman and Kira were waiting. "Any sign?" Haldeman asked as Trask approached. Trask shook his head. "The bunker's been used, but not for a while." There are rations missing though, and the generator's still on. Their skimmer's still here, Haldeman said, nodding towards it, so they can't have left. Only leaves one place, Trask said. Haldeman and Kira both looked over at the entrance to the excavation. There's something else though, Trask said. PV tells me there's a storm coming. We have about 25 minutes, maybe less, before it hits. Fear showed on Haldeman's face. Then let's get out of here. And get caught in it like your men? I don't think so. You and Kira wait in the bunker. I'm going to take a look at the excavation. We need to warn the professor and the others, Kira said. I'll come with you. Trask shook his head. No. You wait in the bunker. If everything's okay down there, I'll bring them up with me. But they may need help if there's been. Trask looked at Haldeman and nodded his head towards the bunker. Haldeman took Kira's arm and pulled her towards the dome. She continued arguing, as Trask moved across the sand towards the hole in the ground. Trask paused at the top of the entrance. Between the circle of heavy plastic barriers, he could see that the ground had been dug away to uncover the entrance to a long passageway. The two power cables hung over the edge of the hole and disappeared into the passageway. There was a drop of only a couple of meters down to the bottom of the passageway, and Trask jumped into it. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The passageway continued off into the distance, and he could see a dull glow coming from a square in the ground up ahead. The passageway was large, but Trask was tall, and he had to stoop slightly to move along its length as he followed the power cables. As he got closer, it became apparent that the glow was coming from a hole that had been cut in the stone floor of the passageway. The section of stone that had been cut free rested on the ground beside the hole. The power cables disappeared over the edge, and were connected to a suspensor elevator that rested on the floor beneath the hole. There was a very faint hum from the suspensor field. Trask dropped into a squat, peering through the hole to try to see what was below, but he could see little. He paused for a moment, briefly considering going back up. Jumping into the unknown was not a smart move, but with the storm approaching he was running out of time. If Klaus was down there, he still had time to find him and get him back to the dome before the storm hit. If he missed the chance now, the storm would destroy the entrance to the excavation, and he would never get Klaus out. Holding the assault rifle in a ready position, Trask stepped into the suspensor field. The hum increased slightly as the field took his weight, and began to lower him to the floor of the chamber. His eyes flicked around the room looking for movement but finding none. When he reached the bottom of the chamber, he stepped off the suspensor field and back towards the wall as he looked around. Stone slabs stood upright from the floor about 50 meters away, blocking whatever was causing the blue glow behind them. There was something on the ground beside him. He glanced down and found a corpse. It had been a man once, but now it was mummified, the pale grey flesh stretched taut over bones completely drained of all essence. A name tag on its breast pocket read Tui. Trask moved across the floor towards the first of the slabs. 6 stone slabs formed a perfect circle. In their center was a circular dais, its sides covered in hieroglyphics, like those that covered the faces of the slabs. The center of the dais was open, the stone wedges that formed its surface opened like the flowers of a petal and standing upright. Trask looked over the edge. A chasm dropped away into blackness. Trask could not see the bottom. Trask moved out from the circle of stone slabs and towards the end of the room. An archway was open at the end of the room, and there was a faint blue glow coming from within. Moving soundlessly, alert for any movement, Trask edged towards the doorway. As he approached, he could see rows of stone shelving that ran the length of the second chamber. Then metal tablets of some kind filled the shelves. Arcane freezers covered the walls on either side of the shelves, and some kind of tableau was carved into the stone floor. Sitting in the center of the tableau was Professor Christoph Klauser. His legs were crossed, his hands resting on his knees and his eyes closed. Trask watched for a moment, seeing the professor's chest moving slightly as he breathed. "Professor Klauser," Trask said evenly, "you're coming with me." There was a long moment of silence. Then Klauser's eyes slowly opened and he looked at Trask. "No," said Klauser, "I'm not going anywhere." The corners of his mouth turned up into a rictus grin. "And neither are you," he finished. Chapter 6. With the rifle trained on Klauser, Trask glanced around the room. He could see no movement, and hear nothing other than the faint hum of the suspensor lift back near the entrance. On the wall beside the doorway, a solar system had been carved with each of the nearby planets marked. On the far side was a stylized carving of a storm with a multi-limbed creature in its center. Something about the carving made Trask feel uneasy. Against the wall below the carving were two more bodies, mummified like Tui. The other two members of Klauser's team. Trask could see no movement anywhere. As far as he could tell, he and Klaus were alone in the chamber. "I don't know you," Klaus said. "Who are you?" Trask. "I'm a tracker." "Ah," Klaus said, nodding once. "Of course. You don't seem surprised. I knew someone would come sooner or later. Nothing stays buried forever." There seemed to be a double meaning to that, and Trask frowned slightly. Klaus was playing games with him. Why was the man so confident? "You killed 2 men on Trilos," Trask said. "Some knowledge should not be shared. You killed the other 3 here as well." "No," Klaus said. Without taking his eyes or the gun off Klauser, Trask nodded his head back towards the entrance. "Tui over there looks pretty dead." "Yes. But I didn't kill him." "Who did?" "I'm not sure it has a name." Klaus smiled at Trask's confusion. "But how could you possibly understand? A man with a tiny intellect, who thinks power comes from a gun. It's feeling powerful enough right now." "Is it?" More games. Again, Trask wondered what was making the man feel so confident. Holding the gun on Klaus with one hand, Trask reached down to his belt and retrieved a pair of wristbinders. He threw them across to Klauser. They landed on his lap, but Klaus ignored them. "Put them on," Trask said. "No. Put them on or I'll show you how much power a tiny intellect holding a gun has." Klaus laughed. "No, I don't think so. Mr. Trask. If you were here to kill me, you would have done it already. You have a warrant for me alive, don't you? You're not going to kill me." Trask looked hard at Klauser. "I can shoot your fingers off one at a time until you put the binders on. It'll hurt, and you'll lose the ability to perform basic tasks ever again. But you won't die." For a long moment Klaus looked at Trask, assessing whether he was serious, then deciding he was. Klauser's smile faded, replaced with a snarl of anger. "You're an animal," Klaus yelled, "nothing more. An ignorant animal with no more idea what I've achieved here than a dog. You don't have the tiniest hint of intelligence." "Major," Peavy's voice sang over the communicator. "Animals like you," Klaus screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. Trask raised the gun. "Shut up." "The storm's moving faster, Major," Peavy continued. "We don't minutes cut." Peavy's voice disappeared into static. Trask looked at Klauser. "We're out of time, Professor. Put the binders on now, or I shoot a hand off and drag you out." "You don't. And if you speak again, I'll do it anyway." For a few pregnant seconds Klaus stared at him. Seeing something in Trask's eyes, Klaus reached for the binders and clicked them over his wrists. When both cuffs were locked in position around his wrists, the energy beam between them shortened, pulling Klauser's hands together. Klaus unfolded his legs and stood up. Trask moved back towards the wall, keeping the gun trained on Klaus and pointing him towards the suspensor lift. Klaus walked across the room, still seething, and over to the lift. Pushing the barrel of the rifle into the small of Klauser's back, Trask stepped into the suspensor field with him. As soon as they reached the hole cut into the ceiling of the chamber, the noise could be heard. The scream of wind grew steadily louder as Trask pushed Klaus out of the suspensor field and into the tunnel leading to the surface. It was cold here, and wind was howling down the passageway, pushing them both backwards. Both men had to stoop and lean into the wind to make any progress along the passage. Klaus was moving slowly against the wind, but Trask jammed the gun into his back, pushing him ahead. Even before they reached the end of the tunnel, rain was cascading into the hole, washing the blue sand from the surface into the passageway in a torrent of thin mud. Beneath the hole leading out of the tunnel, the wind and the rain were like a physical force, pushing them down so hard it was difficult to stand. Klaus shouted something at Trask, but the noise of the storm made it impossible to hear. Trask gripped the back of Klaus's belt and lifted him off the ground. As Klaus's feet left the surface of the tunnel, he was forced to put his hands against the wall to steady himself. Trask lifted him upwards, and Klaus scrambled awkwardly through the lip of the hole and out onto the surface above. Shouldering the rifle, Trask braced his feet against the edge of the tunnel walls and pushed himself upwards. He gripped the rim of the hole with both hands and pulled himself out. Klaus was on his knees, looking up into the howling storm and shouting something. His words were whipped away by the wind. There was a stench now, the stink of ozone from the storm, but something fetid beneath it too, like rotting meat. Trask managed to get to his feet, but the rain and the wind were so fierce that it was difficult to stand. He gripped the back of Klaus's collar and pulled him to his feet. It was almost impossible to see anything now, the storm turning the area around them into nothing but fog. Where the hell was the bunker? From the hole leading down into the tunnel, the two power cables snaked across the blue sand and disappeared into the storm. Half dragging and half pushing Klaus in front of him, Trask staggered forward, doing his best to keep one boot on the power cables as he went. The wind was blowing horizontally, shoving the rain against them so hard now that it was like being physically punched. Several times Klaus lost his feet, and it was only Trask's grip on his collar that kept him upright. And several times Trask lost his footing too, falling to the ground and dragging Klaus with him. Legs straining, Trask pushed himself back up, pulling Klaus behind him. Agonizingly, Trask staggered through the storm, dragging Klaus behind him as the torrential rain and howling wind attacked them both. How far was it to the bunker? Trask could see nothing through the gloom. He could barely keep his eyes open at all with the wind smashing the rain into his face. It was becoming hard to even breathe now. The rain rushed up his nose, making him feel like he was drowning as he fought across the surface of the desert. He could not see the cables now, but could still feel them with his boot. If he lost them, something dark loomed ahead of them, making Trask's heart skip. Instinctively his arm moved for the rifle, but he knew there was no way he could use it in the storm. The dark shape grew wider, and Trask realized it was the edge of the bunker. With a final surge of effort, Trask lunged forward, heaving Klaus beside him. They collapsed against the door of the bunker, the storm attacking them with such ferocity now that it was almost impossible to stand. Trask's hands scrambled around desperately for the pad beside the doorway, but he was unable to find it. Rubbing fingers frozen by the bitter cold up and down the wall, he searched for the pad, but his fingers were too numb to locate it. Resting his forehead against the door and squeezing his eyes shut against the rain, Trask curled his hand into a fist. He smashed his fist against the door, hard enough to break the skin. Again and again he punched the door, putting as much weight behind it as he could, despite the awkwardness of his position. Nothing. Feeling his feet being dragged out from under him, Trask hammered the door again. And again. He began to lose his footing in the sand shifting beneath him, sliding away from the door. As he fell, he felt his face sliding across the door. And realized the door was moving. The calm inside the bunker hit him in the face so hard it was like being punched, as Trask fell forward through the doorway. Grunting with the effort, he pulled his arm forward, dragging Klaus inside with him. The motor that operated the door had nowhere near enough power to close the door against the barrage of wind and rain that attacked it, but PV and Haldeman leaned against it, pushing it back into place, until it finally clicked shut. Lying in a puddle of blue mud and shivering in the sudden warmth, Trask lay there for a moment. "Thanks," he muttered at Kira, who stood beside the door pad on the inside. She knelt down beside him, pulling his cloak away from his face and wiping mud away from his mouth. "It's okay, Mr. Trask," she said. "You're safe now." "Safe?" Klaus spluttered from the ground beside Trask, his lips curling up into a grin. "Safe? You're going to die. All of you." Drawing in a painful breath, Trask marshaled enough strength to slam his fist into the side of Klaus's head, knocking him unconscious. "Not today," he muttered. Interlude 4. 2 days ago. Klaus set down another of the thin metal tablets on the ground. It gave a dull clank when it hit the stone floor. Whatever it was made from, it was a metal unlike anything he had ever seen before, except in the library on Trilos. But the tablets there were incomplete. Only a fraction of them were left behind, the others taken or defaced, and those that were left had taught him nothing. Unlike the library here. Klaus stood with some difficulty. He had not slept in 5 days, not since he and the others had opened the tomb and awakened the creature beneath the dais. For 5 days Klaus had done nothing but read and read, absorbing the knowledge of a dead technology in the language of a dead civilization. He had barely started on the slates, but already he had learned so much. With his legs painfully cramped, Klaus moved across the floor of the chamber away from the shelves. The dried husks that had once been Milner and Jakob's lay against the wall where the creature had left them. Both men had tried to flee after the creature had absorbed Tui, thinking to somehow find shelter here. It had followed them and sucked them both dry, its translucent skin pulsing and growing stronger with each life consumed. As the blood flowed through his exhausted limbs again, Klaus's legs began to tingle and sting. He ignored it. With one hand on the archway for balance, Klaus looked out towards the stone circle. The slabs blocked his view of the creature from here, but he could see its slight glow as it rested. Klaus walked across the stone floor and moved between the nearest of the slabs. The creature sat on the closed top of the dais, its multitude of unevenly sized limbs splayed out beneath its squat and bloated torso. The misshapen head rested against its chest, its eyes closed. "What do you want?" the creature hissed, its guttural rumbling tone making the words barely intelligible. "It has been 5 days since you fed," Klaus said. "Will you rest forever?" The creature let out a heavy breath. For a long moment Klaus thought it would ignore him, but after a time it spoke. "Beware your insolence does not tax my tolerance too far, little insect." Klaus smiled. "A little insect who lifted you from your tomb. Beware your ingratitude does not tax my patience." The creature's eyes snapped open and it whirled on him, tendrils whipping at the air in fury. "You think to anger a god?" Its voice rumbled so loudly that the chamber seemed to shake. "A god," Klaus said, his hand resting on the nearest of the slabs, his fingers tracing over the hieroglyphics. "No." Klaus managed to keep his voice steady, but his smile was forced and he hoped the creature would not notice the slight shake in his hand. "Not a god," Klaus continued, "a native of the planet, twisted and deformed by exposure to the primal forces of the planet itself. One able to harness those forces through a biological feedback generator." The creature looked at him, its tendrils flailing furiously. "You speak sacrilege, little insect." "I don't think so. The crust of the planet is uneven, just like that of every other. There are key places where the right geological conditions create a conduit to the core of the world. This is one. There are others. Just as there are on Trilos and Rylu." The creature said nothing, but its tendrils whipped around in anger. "And biological feedback generators built above these conduits give access to the rifts. A priest exposed to the forces can use them, harness them in some primitive way." "Primitive?" the creature screeched, its fury making the chamber shake again. "Primitive," Klaus said again, taunting the creature. "The forces can't be properly controlled, only directed in some way. And when they are harnessed, they damage the priest harnessing them. They cause mutations and biological changes in him. You think you understand something of the forbidden." Klaus smiled, his confidence returning as he saw how shaken the creature was by its realization that he understood. This wasn't some arcane supernatural power, it was science. A science that had been shrouded in darkness, disguised as the worship of a god, and used to subdue an entire civilization for thousands of years. A science that he now understood. And could control. "Yes, I think so," he said. Klaus raised his hands and pointed at the slabs that surrounded the dais. 6 biological feedback generators. They appear to be in a circle, but they're not. Each has been placed along a fault line tracing irregularities in the planet's crust. The mathematics to calculate these placings to such a precise degree. He trailed off, shaking his head slightly at the thought of the precision needed, calculations that must have taken scientists generations to divine, each taking up the work of the last when he died. But only one is activated, he said, touching the slab closest to him, its surface glowing slightly at his touch, enough to awaken you but not to release you. The creature was silent, but the flailing of its tentacles betrayed its anger and its frustration. For a long moment the creature stared at Klauser, its pupilless orbs burrowing into his eyes. "What do you want, little insect?" Klaus smiled. "Power." "All do. Be more specific." "Others came here to a co-draw with me. They must be silenced." "And then?" "There are 4 cities on the other side of the planet, 18 million colonists filling them. You want them silenced too?" Klaus inclined his head. "Only if they have difficulty accepting their new god." Chapter 7. Trask lay on the floor of the bunker for a long moment. His cloak was saturated with rainwater, and to his surprise torn in places from the ferocity of the storm. He pulled it off, leaving it on the floor as he sat up. "I told you to come looking after 10 minutes, Trask said to Peavy. "I had confidence in your ability to keep the situation under control," Peavy said, his sing-song voice without inflection. Besides, crossing the area between the bunker and the excavation seemed like a foolish thing to do during the storm. Trask gave him a look. "What do we do now?" Haldeman asked. "We wait for the storm to pass and we hope we can get one of the skimmers moving again," Trask said. "Otherwise we have a long walk back to the main dig." "Actually," Peavy said, "I do not believe the storm will pass." "Meaning?" Trask asked. "I have been monitoring it," Peavy said. "It moved here rapidly, accelerating faster than atmospheric conditions would suggest was possible, then stopped once it reached us. It has not moved since. It is just hovering here." "What?" Haldeman almost shouted. "That's impossible." "It is a statement of fact, Sergeant Haldeman," Peavy said. "What you're saying is ridiculous," Haldeman persisted, his tone beginning to grow a note of hysteria. "It's a storm. It's not a skimmer. It can't just move then stop in one place." Haldeman turned to Trask. "Your Ando's malfunctioning, Trask. This is ridiculous." "Get a hold of yourself, Sergeant," Trask said, giving him a hard stare. "But what he's saying is ludicrous. It can't be." "Sergeant." Haldeman trailed off, looking at Trask, his eyes showing how close he was to losing control. With an effort, he managed to regain some composure. "All right," Haldeman said after a moment, "what do we do?" "There's enough rations over there for us to ride it out for 4 or 5 days. Probably double that, if we live on half rations." "So we just wait?" Haldeman asked. Trask breathed out, as he considered. "No," he said eventually, "I don't think we'll be allowed to." Haldeman frowned again. "Not allowed? You think someone else is coming?" "I think someone else is already here." He looked at Kira. "See if you can wake Klaus up. I didn't hit him that hard." Kira nodded and moved over to Klauser. She began fussing around him, lifting his head and gently patting his face. After a few minutes, Klaus began to stir. He groaned slightly and opened his eyes, wincing at the pain from the large red mark on the side of his face where Trask had hit him. Kira helped Klaus into a sitting position. Klaus appeared groggy for a moment, still dazed. After a while, he looked around. As he recalled where he was and what had happened, his smug look of contempt reappeared. "Are you ready to let me go?" he asked Trask with a sneer. Trask shook his head. "Get rid of the storm." "How can I do that?" Klaus said, giving an exaggerated show of confusion. "I have no control over natural weather events." "It's not natural. It's a storm. It appeared when I found you in the tomb. It moved here very quickly when I became a threat to you. It's waiting outside now that you're my prisoner." "You think I'm your prisoner?" Klaus laughed. "You ignorant fool. You have no idea what is happening here." "I'll tell you what is happening here," Trask said quietly, leveling his rifle at Klauser. "I'm telling you to disperse the storm. If you don't do it, I'll kill you. Don't make hollow threats, Klaus said with a sneer. You won't kill me. Your warrant says to bring me in alive. I can't execute the warrant while I'm stuck in here. All I can do is wait to die. If I kill you, the storm will have nothing left to protect. It will go and I can leave. I won't have you, but I won't be dead either. Klaus's sneer disappeared. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Trask, as he tried to gauge the man once more. You're bluffing, Klaus said eventually. Are you sure? The two men looked at each for a long time. What happens to me if I make the storm go? Klaus asked. You get another chance to try to take control of the situation, Trask said. If I kill you now, you don't. After a moment, Klaus closed his eyes. Kulu guesh tralalu karthu, he muttered. Kallu truf guesh kardu. What's he saying? Haldeman demanded. It's in ancient Shtu, Kira said. I don't understand much of it. Something about the Master of Storms, I think. Kluish trag hu gauhush kel shatuish, Klaus continued. Gusht kala kala keshestu trauk. He mumbled more harsh syllables, the guttural words of a dead language. The noise outside began to grow quieter, so slightly at first that it was unclear whether it was really happening or not. But after a time, it became apparent that the ferocity of the storm was beginning to drop, as Klaus continued mumbling. Finally it became completely quiet outside. Klaus opened his eyes and looked at Trask. He gave a small smile. Happy now? Trask's gun was still trained on Klauser. He flicked his head towards the door. Still smiling smugly, Klaus stood up. He moved towards the doorway, and reached a hand towards the panel beside it. No, wait, Haldeman said, pointing his rifle at Klauser. We have no idea what's out there. We can't trust him. We can't stay here forever either, Trask said. Open the door, Professor. Klaus looked at Haldeman, eyebrows raised high ironically. Haldeman lowered his gun. Smiling widely, Klaus touched the door panel and the door whispered open. It was silent outside, the silence so absolute that it was frightening. The area outside the bunker had been swept completely clean. All trace of their footprints, of the skimmer tracks and of any movement near the bunker had been completely erased. In the near distance, the plastic shields around the entrance to the tomb were gone, lifted and carried away by the storm. The electrical cables trailing across the ground were buried, with only small sections of their shielded length poking through the blue sands in a few places. Confidently, Klaus stepped out into the eerie stillness of the desert. Trask and the others followed behind him. Life signs, Peavy? Trask asked quietly. Nothing, Major, Peavy said, checking his wrist unit. We appear to be alone. I doubt it. Stay alert. Yes, Major. Haldeman started moving towards the skimmers, with Kira at his side. Klaus walked across the blue sands, with the casual air of a man taking a stroll for exercise. He reached the middle of the area between the bunker and the excavation site. That's enough, Trask said. Klaus turned and looked at him. His face was completely blank, all trace of his earlier sneer gone. What now? He asked. Now you come with me. Klaus shook his head. Wrong again. Lifting his head slightly, Klaus began to mutter in the dead tongue again. Kulu guesh tralalu karthu. Kallu truf guesh kardu. The stink of ozone and rotting flesh filled the air so powerfully that it was like a physical sensation. The blast of wind and its howl were so sudden, it was like being struck. Trask! Kira screamed. Flicking his head to the side, Trask looked across at Kira. She was standing about 50 meters away, halfway between the bunker and the skimmer, with Haldeman 20 meters ahead of her. Kira had one arm raised and was pointing behind Trask, her eyes wide with fear and her mouth hanging open. Instinctively, Trask jumped to one side, turning as he moved, and falling to one knee as he brought the assault rifle up to bear. The bunker was about 50 meters away from him. Between him and the bunker was a pool of blue sand that was turning, like a whirlpool in the desert. The circle span faster, sand flicking away from it as the hole collapsed in on itself. And something rose from the sand. A blue glow came from the ground as the elongated skull began to rise higher, its pupilless eyes staring outwards. The squat malformed body rose from the sands, its long uneven tendrils undulating around it. The stench of ozone and decay was so strong it was almost overpowering, the howl of the wind so loud that it was painful. Even in his crouch, the force of the storm threatened to push Trask over with its power. The creature emerged fully from the hole in the sand, and somehow floated above it, swaying slightly. "Yah!" Haldeman screamed, terror stealing meaning from his words. He raised his rifle to his shoulder and fired at the creature, holding the trigger down, so there was a continuous stream of energy blasting across the sands. "No!" Trask shouted. As the energy blasts hit the creature, it shifted to the side, its body pushed over at an angle. It whipped its head around to look at Haldeman. At that closer range, the high-energy blasts should have completely destroyed the creature. It seemed to do little more than annoy it. The creature's tendrils flapped up and down for a moment, as the halo of energy blasts from Haldeman's rifle surrounded the creature's body. Then the tendrils snapped downwards, pointing at the sand. They quivered slightly, as though sucking at the ground. The creature stabbed one hand out towards Haldeman. A flash of white energy so intense that it burned the eyes sizzled across the distance in a ragged line from the creature's hand, and struck Haldeman's body. He was hurled into the air, his body spasming as his bones shattered and his flesh blackened. Haldeman's charred corpse was flung 100 meters into the air, and began to arc downwards towards the blue sands. Before it hit the ground, Trask was on his feet and sprinting towards Clouser. "Peavy," he screamed into his communicator, doubting he could even be heard over the storm, "get the girl into the tomb." As he closed the distance between him and Clouser, Trask could see Klauser's face. Klaus had his head back, his arms raised in front. He was looking up at the howling sky, his mouth wide open. A laugh of madness was drowned out by the noise of the storm. Trask barreled into Clouser, his left arm slamming into Klauser's stomach hard enough to lift him off the ground, his arms and legs flailing outwards like a rag doll's as his head snapped forward against his chest. Holding Klaus against his chest, Trask turned back towards the creature, his feet digging furrows into the ground as he slid to a halt. He jammed the barrel of the rifle up under Klauser's chin, snapping his head back. "Call it off," Trask yelled into Klauser's ear. "Call it off or we die together." "You savage animal." "You have no," Klaus screamed. "Now." For a moment, the creature looked over towards Haldeman's smoldering corpse. Then its head slowly swung towards Trask and Clouser. It began to move slowly across the blue sand, its deformed frame rocking up and down slightly as it crept towards them. The winds howled around behind it, screaming in fury, as the blank emotionless face of the creature looked at them. "Kulu guish tralalu karthu," Klaus began to intone, "Kalu truf guish kardu." More of the alien words cascaded out of his mouth, as the creature slowly, inexorably moved across the sand towards them. Klaus continued his litany of dead words as the creature approached. It stopped when it was 5 meters from them, somehow floating above the sands as it stared at them with its blank, pupilless eyes. The stench of decay was intense. Klaus fell silent, and the creature simply looked at them for a moment, unmoving. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as though considering the tiny, insignificant insects before it. Its tendrils swayed gently in the air, as though caressing some invisible shape imperceptible to any other eyes. Then they began to move faster, flicking through the air, their tips scything through nothingness. The creature's head suddenly tilted down, its eyes glaring at them. Its tendrils snapped downwards, pointing at the ground, and began to shake, as the creature sucked at the planet, drawing up its natural energies. "No," Klaus hissed, realization turning to fear. "No? No." As the creature raised one hand and pointed at them, Trask stepped backwards. He tried to shove Klaus forward at the creature, but Klaus clutched at his forearm with both hands, his fingers digging into Trask's arm with desperation. White-hot energy sizzled at them, ripping the air apart with the raw fury of its power, and struck their bodies. Agony more intense than anything he had ever imagined coursed through Trask's frame. His muscles convulsed, spasming uncontrollably, and his eyes rolled back sightlessly into his head. He screamed as white-hot pain knifed through every part of his body, a million razors slicing his skin from his frame and boring into the flesh beneath. As the sheet of pure energy struck their bodies, PV knelt behind Trask, gripping one of Trask's thighs with one metal hand, lifting him off the ground, his other hand gripping the electrical cable that ran across the ground. For long minutes the lightning ripped through Trask, his body bucking uncontrollably, as he howled in unspeakable agony. The energy ripped through his body, but instead of destroying it, as it had Haldeman's, as it had the Marines in the desert, the energy passed through him, through Peavy's metal frame, and into the electrical cabling that ran across the desert. And into the fusion reactor inside the bunker. With a blinding flash of energy, the reactor exploded, destroying the bunker. Razor-edged shards of the dome's construction rained down upon them, ripping into the ground beside them and scything through the air around them. Several larger shards slammed into the creature's back and stuck there. Shocked by the sudden explosion, the creature whipped around to look at the source of the blast, the lightning from its hand suddenly dying. Snatching Trask's assault rifle from his powerless hands, Peavy aimed it at the creature and held his finger on the trigger, blasting a continuous stream of energy at the creature, as he backed across the sand, dragging Trask's limp body with him. Buffeted by a continuous barrage of energy, the creature was pushed back, screaming in fury as it turned its face away from the blast. The sudden release from the agony of the lightning was almost enough to knock Trask out. Exerting all his will, he managed to cling on to consciousness as Peavy dragged him backwards. Klaus's body was still across Trask's chest, his fingers digging into Trask's forearms. With an effort, Trask tried to shrug them off. Dying, Klaus looked up at Trask. "Words," he muttered, "words are the power." Then he was gone, his body falling away from Trask's and onto the blue sand, where Trask saw it lie broken. And then oblivion took him. Chapter 8. Trask came to as Peavy was dragging him along the ground towards the end of the tunnel. The ground around them was awash with blue mud, and there was more of it pouring in from the hole leading to the surface. Trask's entire body screamed. The burning agony from the energy had passed, but had been replaced with a throbbing pain that seemed to pulse through his body. His skin felt burned and stung where it rubbed against his clothing or his body armor. Peavy's metal frame was hot, steam rising off it as the last of the rainwater evaporated. "How long was I out?" Trask muttered. 3 minutes, Major," Peavy replied, "no longer." "The girl?" "In the tomb. I put her in the tunnel before I came back for you." "Armaments?" "Your assault rifle and small arms for each of us. I was forced to leave my rifle and the bag of supplies near the skimmer." "Are you damaged?" "Some impairment. I have not yet been able to run full diagnostics, but I estimate 45% functioning remaining." They reached the hole in the floor leading down into the tomb. The electrical cables running along the floor of the tunnel were blackened, their insulation melted away. The suspensor lift on the floor below the hole was a mess of melted plastic and burned-out electrical components. Painfully, Trask climbed down the cabling, his muscles screaming at him as he went. Peavy followed with noticeable clumsiness. Trask thought 45% may have been optimistic. Kira was waiting for them at the bottom. Despite her obvious fear, her eyes were alive with excitement. "Trask, this place is a 12th century burial chamber. It's almost entirely preserved. Study it if you survive," he said shortly. Kira flinched as if slapped. She swallowed and nodded. "What was that thing?" "I don't know. Its bed's over there," he said, pointing at the open dais between the stone circle, "and its book collection through there." "It killed Professor Klauser," Kira said, "but he was controlling it." "Why would it kill him?" "I think Klaus outgrew his usefulness." Trask took his assault rifle from Peavy and turned it to the side to check the readout. About half charge remaining. Not that it was going to make much difference against the thing up top. It hadn't last time. He looked up at Kira. "Before he died," Klaus said, "words are the power. Does that mean anything to you?" Kira shook her head. "No. I don't know what that means. The stone slabs there have words carved on them, and the room at the end has more words carved on the walls. See if you can read any of them." Kira nodded and turned away. "Be quick," Trask said, "I doubt we have long." He turned to Peavy. There's a room at the end with shelving. I didn't have time to look through it before. I couldn't see another exit, but I may have missed something. Yes, Major, Peavy said, crossing the room. One of his skeletal metal legs dragged behind him with a distinct limp, the hydraulics on that side completely destroyed. Shouldering the assault rifle, Trask moved to the nearest wall and began to examine its surface closely with his fingers. If there was one exit, there may be another. He doubted it, but they were short on options. Kira, he called as he moved along the surface, any progress? I can't make out much of this, she called back. It's written in a symbology different to anything I've seen before. It's much older. Anything about power? There's something. I can read, the power of life is here, and the forbidden, I think, secrets of power. Nothing about words of power, though. Keep looking. There was a distant hiss of rage from the tunnel above, and a scraping noise as something large and very unhappy worked its way along the passage. Leave it, Kira. We're out of time. Fall back to the other room, and try to read the words in there. As Kira scrambled out from between the slabs and ran across the room to the second chamber, Trask hurried along the wall, still searching. He was giving the walls only a cursory inspection now, but every second might make a difference. The smell of rot grew stronger. The light from the tunnel above was blocked out. Abandoning his search of the chamber walls, Trask raced across to the stone circle and moved behind one of the slabs. He trained the assault rifle on the entrance hole in the roof, as he took cover. Slowly tendrils snaked down through the ceiling, writhing obscenely as they caressed the air beneath them. Something dripped from the tendrils as the creature began to descend. At first Trask thought it was mud or rain from the storm dripping off the creature, but he realized after a moment that it was thicker, more viscous, and had a purplish tinge. Was the thing wounded? Not from the rifles. The entrance hole was larger than the creature, but not by much. It had to twist its torso to squeeze through. As it did so, it screeched in pain, and more of the viscous fluid ran down its side. Trask realized that there were broken shards of the bunker's wall stuck in the creature's body. As it squeezed through the hole, it was disturbing some of them, twisting them in its wounds. Energy weapons won't kill it. Edged weapons might. But how the hell to get close enough to use them? Peavy, Trask called, see if you can find anything sharp we can use as a weapon. Yes, Major. Having maneuvered through the entrance hole with some difficulty, the creature began to float down towards the floor of the chamber, its tendrils undulating below it. The blank orbs of its eyes peered outwards, but it was impossible to tell where its gaze was focused. Hovering above the stone surface of the tomb's floor, the creature began to drift across the ground. Towards the stone circle where Trask was standing. The creature was moving slowly, but the chamber was not large and it would take it only a few seconds to reach him. Trask's skin was raw, burned from the lightning above and hypersensitive. He felt warmth from the slab beside his face. At first he thought it only his imagination, but the heat began to increase. Keeping one hand on the trigger of the assault rifle, and his gaze fixed on the approaching creature, Trask lifted his other hand to touch the stone beside him. It was definitely warm, and growing warmer as the creature drew nearer. What the hell does it mean? Moving to the side so that the slab obscured the creature's view, Trask backed around the dais and over to the far side of the circle. He could no longer see the creature just as it could not see him, but he could hear its faint hiss and somehow feel its presence. When he reached the far side of the circle, Trask ducked around the slab and sprinted for the second chamber at the end of the room. Peavy was standing on the ground with one leg bent at the knee, and the other stretched out behind him, unable to bend it. Beneath his foot was one of the metal tablets from the shelf, and he was bending it backwards and forwards, working persistently at it to try to make it break. On the ground beside him were two more tablets, now broken in half, with the torn edges rough and edged. Kira was standing with her back to Peavy, facing the wall and frowning in concentration, as she tried to decipher the hieroglyphics carved on the wall. Anything? Trask asked. Kira shrugged. Something about forbidden secrets again. Nothing about words of power. The stones out there are heating up. What does that mean? Kira turned to look at him. The stones? The slabs in the stone circle. They're hot to the touch and getting hotter. Kira shook her head. Some kind of thermodynamic process? I don't know. The ancients had a technology that we don't understand. Helsa might have some idea. Helsa's not here. PV, we're out of time. PV abandoned the metal sheet he was standing on, and awkwardly pushed himself to his feet. He collected 2 of the pieces of broken tablet, and handed the other 2 to Trask. There is not much of an edge, he said in his sing-song voice. How will you get close enough to use it? Haven't figured that out yet. Kira, get down behind the shelves. Trask moved to the side of the doorway, assault rifle in one hand, a broken piece of metal in the other. He rested the second piece of metal tablet against the wall near his feet. PV took up a similar position on the other side, drawing out his twin pistols. For long, painful moments they waited. The stench of decay grew stronger and stronger, until it was so stifling it became harder to breathe. Trask shifted the broken tablet in his hand. The faint hiss of the creature was just outside the doorway. To Trask's surprise it spoke. You profane this place with your presence, it rumbled. Its words were guttural and harsh, but understandable. Just. Trask waited for a moment. Then stepped out where the creature could see him. It was waiting beyond the doorway, rocking slowly up and down as it hovered above the ground. Its tendrils stroked nothingness and its blank eyes stared. Trask lifted his hand to his face, touching his forehead with his middle and ring finger. Kaesh, he began. The creature hissed as though stung. Do not insult me with your condescension. Our customs are beyond your understanding. Trask lowered his hand. I meant no insult. And we had no intention of invading your sacred place. We fled when you attacked us. Attacked? The creature seemed incredulous. I cleanse a disease. As I will from all of the world. Trask opened his mouth again, but the creature's tendrils were flicking the air angrily. Just as they had above before each of the lightning strikes. Hefting the broken piece of the tablet in his hand, Trask flicked it away from him, twisting at the waist to put all his weight behind it. His torn muscles and his raw skin sang with pain as he moved, making him groan. The metal shard flew across the air and thudded into the side of the creature's torso, before falling harmlessly to the ground. The creature did not even seem to notice. Instead, its tendrils stabbed downwards at the ground. Trask raised the assault rifle and fired, as PV blazed with both guns from beside him. As the creature was thrown backwards by the barrage of point-blank fire, it pointed out its hand. A fork of white-hot energy sizzled through the doorway. Perhaps because the creature was wounded, or perhaps because its aim was disrupted at the last second, the sheet of white energy missed Trask and PV by inches, and burned against the back wall of the chamber, frying the stone. From the corner of his eye, Trask saw the stone circle glow brightly. He flicked his gaze away from the creature, and over to the circle. The slabs were somehow, impossibly, lighting up as the creature channeled the planet's energy through its body. The stone glowed as though it were on fire, then slowly faded as the lightning from the creature's attack sizzled out. What did it mean? What the hell did it mean? The creature screamed in fury, its voice so loud the whole chamber seemed to shake. It had been pushed off-center by the twin blasts of energy, but now righted itself. Again its tendrils caressed the air. Then they stabbed downwards once more. Words are the power. Words are the power. Trask shifted his aim from the creature. Lining up his assault rifle with the nearest of the stone slabs, he fired. The beam of concentrated energy scythed across the chamber and struck the corner of the thick slab. Stone 2 millennia old shattered into dust, shards burning as they flew through the air in a rain of desecrated chunks. And the creature screamed. Not in anger but in pain. Its tendrils flailed helplessly as it staggered backwards, dazed. After a brief moment it righted itself and turned on them once more. Its tendril began their obscene dance through the air. And Trask destroyed another section of the slab. With another howl of agony, the creature staggered back. This time its howl formed a word. Nu. Trask paused. How much of the charge was left? Couldn't be much. Certainly not enough to destroy the entire circle of stone slabs. With his hand on the trigger, he pointed the assault rifle at the slab again. With his other, he pointed at the open dais at its center. The creature shook its head slowly. I can give you power. Power over worlds. You gave that to Klauser too. Didn't do him much good. I have waited lifetimes. Trask fired at the slab again, desperately hoping there was enough charge left in the gun to actually do anything. Another section of the stone was smashed to dust and burning shards. The creature screamed in pain again, and slowly moved towards the circle. Trask stayed where he was, behind the relative shelter of the archway, with his rifle trained on the slab. He watched as the creature slunk across the chamber and between the slabs. It moved over the open dais and turned to face Trask once more. The blank orbs of its eyes blazed with such intense hatred that Trask shuddered despite himself. Eyes still locked on Trask, the creature began to slowly sink down into the blackness inside the well. As its elongated skull disappeared beneath the rim, the stone petals of the dais began to creak inwards, closing over the top of the creature. With a scrape of tortured stone they closed completely, sealing the creature away once more. Suddenly exhausted, Trask fell against the archway, his raw skin screaming in pain where it rubbed against the ancient stone. For a moment he breathed hard. He turned the rifle over, so he could see the readout on its side. A flashing red warning indicated there was less than 3% charge remaining. He dropped the useless weapon on the floor, where it clattered. Kira emerged from the shelves at the back of the chamber, and crossed to Trask's side. Still leaning against the archway, he turned to look at her. It's gone, she said, crying with relief. No, he said, it's waiting. Epilogue. Once stasis had been reached, PV checked over the readouts. And? Trask asked. I have restored a pulse, Major, PV said, but one so faint it can barely be detected. No sign of neural activity at all. Trask nodded. Alive, though. It'll do. The statis generator sat on Klauser's waist, projecting a narrow force field that formed a tube around his body. Two handles protruded from the generator and stood upwards. PV gripped these and carried the stasis-shrouded body across to Klauser's skimmer. What will they do with him? Kira asked. Trask shrugged. Not much point putting him on trial if he's brain-dead. Maybe it's for the best. Probably just as well nobody will know what he learned at the temple on Trilos or here. Probably. Kira looked at him for a moment. You don't care, do you? This is just a job for you. I'm getting paid to bring Klaus back. That's what I'm doing. But so many people are dead. Could have been a lot more. Kira thought about the thing that had attacked them. She nodded. So what now, she asked. PV and I take Klaus's skimmer and go back to the spaceport. Then we take him back to the Authority. You take Haldeman's skimmer back to the main dig. Up to you what you do after that. What about this? Kira asked, nodding her head towards the entrance to the temple. Trask reached into his pocket and took out a small radio detonator. He handed it to Kira. Be careful with it. It's armed. You need to be a long way from here before you detonate the charges. There's enough explosive down there to make a lot of mess. That's what you were doing down there while PV was putting Professor Klaus's body in the stasis tube? Wiring the place up with explosives. Trask nodded. But why? Kira said cynically, that's not the job you were paid for. Like I said, it could have been a lot more. It still could be if another Klaus finds this place. Kira breathed out, feeling exhausted. She looked down at the detonator in her hand. Suddenly, it seemed too heavy to hold. Goodbye, Kira, Trask said, turning and heading up the slight rise towards the skimmer, blue sand shifting under his boots. Trask, Kira called. He stopped and looked back at her. For a moment, Kira just looked at him. Thanks, Trask. He nodded, and headed for the skimmer once again. All right, just a minute, yelled Gideon from the back room. He pushed himself out of his chair and shoved the curtain aside, entering the front of the shop. You, he said, surprised to see Trask on the other side of the counter. Me. I ain't doing a refund. You bought the skimmer as is. I never said it would. I'm not here for your money. Gideon's eyes narrowed. What then? Last time I came in here, you had a native working here. Where is he? Lousy stew. I got up yesterday morning and he was gone. His bunk has been slept in. Ain't seen him since. Trask nodded and turned to leave. Hey, you need another skimmer. I can do you a good price on a Keller 850. Trask ignored him and left the shop. The shaman was across the street, standing in the shadows between two of the domes. He made no move as Trask walked towards him. When Trask reached the edge of the shadows, he raised his hand and touched the middle and ring fingers to his forehead. The others splayed out. Kaish, Trask said, I'm leaving now. The storm has passed. The shaman said nothing, but stared at Trask with his blank, pupilless eyes. For a moment, they looked at each other. Kaish Trala, Trask said, and lowered his hand. He turned to leave. I will disturb nothing while I am here, said the alien, quoting the ritual greeting in his guttural, drawled pronunciation. Trask looked at him. It's been over 100 years, shaman. Your people should have learned not to trust us by now. Are you so sure you can trust your own? The alien asked, making Trask frown. Kira sat outside the entrance to the temple for over an hour, after Trask and Peavy left. When she was certain they had gone, and would not return, she took the detonator from her pocket. Turning it over, she put her thumb on the switch and clicked it from armed to disarmed. Then she stood up and walked towards the entrance.